Imagine two men born within a decade of each other, both German, both brilliant, both convinced that everything around them was fundamentally broken. They never met. They probably never read each other's work with any care. Yet somehow, these two thinkers would come to define the two great opposing currents of thought that would shape the entire 20th century and continue to shape how we argue about everything today. Karl Marx, working in the reading room of the British Museum, surrounded by economic reports and statistical tables, convinced that he had discovered the scientific laws governing human society. Friedrich Nietzsche, isolated in Swiss mountain towns, half-blind, scribbling notes about the death of God and the future of human greatness. One believed humanity's problem was economic. The other believed it was spiritual. One thought the solution was collective revolution. The other thought it was individual transformation. Here's what makes this fascinating. They were both responding to exactly the same world. The Industrial Revolution was tearing apart traditional society. Cities were growing at terrifying speed. Old certainties about God, king, and social order were collapsing. Workers were being fed into factories like fuel. The gap between rich and poor was widening into a chasm. Anyone paying attention could see that something was deeply wrong. But when Marx looked at a factory, he saw stolen labor. When Nietzsche looked at the same factory, he saw something else entirely: the victory of a slave morality that had turned human beings into identical, replaceable units. Same reality, completely different interpretations. Marx would say that the workers' misery came from exploitation, from the theft of surplus value, from a system that turned human creativity into profit for someone else. Change the economic system, and you change everything. Nietzsche would say that the workers' misery came from accepting weakness as virtue, from internalizing a moral system designed to make powerful people feel guilty and weak people feel righteous. Change the values, and you change everything. This isn't just an academic disagreement. This is the fundamental split in how we think about human problems. Do we fix the systems or do we fix the souls? Do we redistribute wealth or do we revalue values? Do we think in terms of classes or in terms of individuals? What's strange is that both of them were absolutely certain they were right. Marx spent decades in that library, building what he considered an irrefutable scientific analysis of capitalism. He had the data, he had the historical patterns, he had the logical proofs. Nietzsche, meanwhile, was equally certain that economic thinking itself was part of the problem, a symptom of the very disease he was trying to diagnose. He thought Marx's entire project was built on the wrong foundation. And here's where it gets interesting. They were both atheists, both materialists in their own way, both hostile to the existing order, both convinced that conventional morality was a lie. They should have been allies. But they represented such fundamentally different visions of what human beings are and what they could become that any alliance was impossible. Marx looked at history and saw progress, dialectical movement, stages of development leading inevitably toward a better world. He saw feudalism giving way to capitalism, giving way to socialism. He saw human freedom expanding. He saw the possibility of a future where the ancient curse of scarcity and domination could finally be overcome. There was hope in Marx, even when he was describing misery. The misery had a purpose. It was birth pangs. Nietzsche looked at history and saw eternal recurrence, the same patterns repeating, the same types of human beings appearing again and again. He saw no progress, only cycles of strength and weakness, health and sickness, creation and decay. And he looked at the modern world with its talk of equality and progress and saw not the birth of something better but the victory of the weak over the strong, the triumph of a life-denying morality over life-affirming power. One of them believed that truth was objective, discoverable through reason and science, and that once we understood the truth about economics and history, we could act on it collectively to build a better world. The other believed that truth itself was a kind of fiction, that what we call truth is always somebody's perspective, somebody's interpretation, serving somebody's interests. So when you hear people today arguing about whether inequality is the fundamental problem or whether our cultural values are the fundamental problem, you're listening to an argument that Marx and Nietzsche framed in the 19th century. When you hear debates about whether we need systemic change or individual responsibility, whether we should think in terms of oppressor and oppressed or in terms of strong and weak, whether equality is the goal or hierarchy is natural, you're hearing echoes of this split. The 20th century would be shaped by attempts to put their ideas into practice. Marxism would inspire revolutions that reshaped half the world. Nietzsche's ideas would be twisted and appropriated by movements he would have despised. But his emphasis on will, power, and the rejection of conventional morality would influence everything from existentialism to postmodernism. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can understand why their conflict matters, we need to understand who these men actually were. Not the myths, not the caricatures, but the actual human beings who developed these ideas. Because the ideas didn't come from nowhere. They came from lived experience, from specific historical moments, from personal struggles and insights. Karl Marx was born in 1818 in Trier, a small city in the Rhineland, at a moment when Germany itself barely existed as a concept. His father was a lawyer, a rational man of the Enlightenment, who had converted from Judaism to Protestantism partly for professional reasons. The family was comfortable, educated, embedded in the world of ideas and civic life. Marx grew up assuming he would enter that same world, that he would become a professor, that he would live the life of the mind within the establishment. That's not what happened. Marx's doctoral dissertation was too radical for the Prussian academic system. His journalism was too provocative. By his mid-20s, he was already being expelled from countries, already living in exile, already committed to revolution rather than reform. He married Jenny von Westphalen, a woman from an aristocratic family who would spend the rest of her life in poverty because of her husband's choices. They moved to Paris, then Brussels, then finally London, where Marx would spend the last decades of his life. London in the 1850s and 60s was the heart of industrial capitalism. It was where you could see the system working at full force. Factories running day and night, fortunes being made, slums expanding, children working 12-hour days, the wealth of empire flowing in while workers lived in conditions that were barely human. Marx walked through this world. He read the factory reports, he studied the economic data, he talked to workers, and he built his analysis from what he saw. But he was always an outsider. He lived in a small flat in Soho, chronically short of money, dependent on financial support from his friend Engels, who managed a factory in Manchester and sent Marx money while also sending him reports about working conditions. Marx spent his days in the British Museum Library, reading everything ever written about economics, building his magnum opus, Capital, which he believed would do for political economy what Darwin had done for biology. He was surrounded by fellow exiles, revolutionaries, radicals from across Europe who had fled after the failed revolutions of 1848. They argued constantly, split into factions, accused each other of betrayal. Marx himself could be brutal in these fights. He had a gift for devastating polemic. He could be petty, vindictive, absolutely convinced of his own correctness. His family life was marked by tragedy. Several of his children died young. The family lived in poverty not because the world offered no opportunities, but because Marx refused to do anything other than his work on capital and revolution. His wife suffered. His surviving children had complicated relationships with his legacy. He was in many ways a difficult man to love, but he kept working, volume after volume of analysis. Thousands of pages trying to show that capitalism wasn't just unfair, but unsustainable, that it contained contradictions that would inevitably destroy it, that the working class would inevitably rise up and create a new form of society. Friedrich Nietzsche was born in 1844, 26 years after Marx. He grew up in a completely different Germany. His father was a Lutheran pastor who died when Nietzsche was 5. He was raised by women, his mother and sister and aunts, in a household saturated with Protestant piety. Everything about his early life pointed toward a conventional academic career in classical philology. And for a while, that's what he did. He was brilliant at languages, at ancient Greek and Latin. He became a professor at the University of Basel at the impossibly young age of 24 before he had even finished his doctorate. He seemed destined for a distinguished career studying ancient texts. But something happened. Nietzsche began to have what he called dangerous thoughts. He started questioning everything he had been taught about morality, about Christianity, about the value of scholarship itself. His health deteriorated. He suffered from terrible headaches, vision problems, digestive issues. He would spend weeks unable to work, lying in dark rooms in agony. He resigned from his professorship and spent the rest of his productive life wandering between small towns in Switzerland, Italy, and southern France. He lived in boarding houses. He walked for hours in the mountains. He wrote books that almost nobody read during his lifetime. He had no students, no disciples, no academic position. He was utterly alone. Where Marx was embedded in a community of revolutionaries, Nietzsche was isolated. Where Marx had a theory of collective action, Nietzsche developed a philosophy of radical individualism. Where Marx worked in the great library of the British Museum, surrounded by the documentary evidence of capitalism, Nietzsche worked in rented rooms, looking inward, examining consciousness itself. His books were strange, aphoristic, sometimes deliberately provocative. He wrote about the death of God not as a celebration, but as a catastrophe that nobody was taking seriously enough. He wrote about master morality and slave morality. He wrote about the will to power. He wrote about the Übermensch, the Overman, a future type of human being who could create values instead of merely following them. And he was completely ignored. His books sold in the dozens. University philosophy departments dismissed him as a failed classicist who had gone off the rails. When he finally collapsed into madness in 1889, having a breakdown on a street in Turin, he had no idea that within 20 years his books would be among the most influential texts in European culture. The contrast is almost perfect. Marx in London, in the center of empire and industry, building a systematic analysis with charts and statistics, thinking in terms of classes and economic forces. Nietzsche in small alpine villages, alone with his thoughts, thinking in terms of values and types of human being, psychological rather than economic. But there's something else happening here, something beneath the surface. Both men were products of a specific kind of German intellectual tradition. They both grew up reading Hegel, the philosopher who had argued that history moved through contradictions, that every thesis generated its antithesis, that spirit was working itself out through time toward greater freedom and self-consciousness. Marx took Hegel's dialectic and, as he put it, turned it right side up. Where Hegel thought ideas drove history, Marx insisted that material conditions drove history, and ideas were just reflections of those conditions. The base determined the superstructure. Economics was reality. Everything else was ideology. Nietzsche had a different relationship with Hegel. He thought the entire project of finding rational patterns in history was a delusion, another symptom of what he called the will to truth, which was really just a will to make existence comfortable and comprehensible. He wanted to smash the whole edifice. So both of them came from the same German philosophical culture, both reacted against it, but in opposite directions. Marx tried to make it more scientific, more materialist, more focused on concrete economic realities. Nietzsche tried to explode it entirely, to show that all these grand systems were just expressions of particular psychological types, particular configurations of power and weakness. Their biographies tell you something important about their philosophies. Marx's life was defined by engagement. He was always part of movements, always collaborating, always writing for specific political purposes. Even when he was alone in the library, he was thinking about how to organize workers, how to build a party, how to make revolution happen. His thought was inherently collective. Nietzsche's life was defined by solitude. He had friends, he had correspondents, but his real work happened in isolation. He wasn't trying to build a movement. He was trying to think thoughts that had never been thought before, to see with eyes that could penetrate beneath the surface of conventional morality. His thought was inherently individual, and both of them paid a price. Marx lived in poverty and saw most of his children die. Nietzsche went mad, possibly from syphilis, possibly from the sheer strain of his thinking, and spent the last 11 years of his life in the care of his mother and sister, unable to speak or write, while his sister edited and published his unpublished work, often distorting it to fit her own nationalist and anti-Semitic agenda. Neither of them lived to see their ideas take over the world. Marx died in 1883 believing that revolution was imminent, but having no idea that within 35 years a revolution claiming his name would take place in Russia. Nietzsche's mental collapse came in 1889, and he died in 1900, before the 20th century that would be so shaped by interpretations and misinterpretations of his work. But even in their lifetimes, even in their isolation and obscurity, they were asking the questions that would define modern politics and culture. What is human nature? What makes us suffer? What would freedom actually look like? Is there such a thing as progress? Should we seek equality or excellence? Is the individual or the collective the unit that matters? When Marx looked at 19th century Europe, he saw a very specific problem. People were suffering, yes, but suffering wasn't new. What was new was the particular form the suffering took. It wasn't the suffering of peasants under feudalism, which was brutal but at least comprehensible within the logic of that system. It was something stranger and more insidious. The word Marx used was alienation. Workers in factories were alienated from the products of their labor. They made things all day, but those things belonged to someone else. They were alienated from the act of working itself because they had no control over how or what they produced. They were alienated from other workers because they were competing for jobs and wages. And they were alienated from their own human nature because human beings are supposed to be creative, self-directed beings, but capitalism turned them into appendages of machines. This wasn't just a moral complaint. Marx thought he was doing science. He was trying to show that capitalism had internal contradictions that would eventually destroy it. The drive for profit would lead capitalists to compete with each other, driving down wages and increasing exploitation. This would immiserate the working class while also creating the conditions for revolution, because workers would become conscious of their shared interests as a class. The problem wasn't that some capitalists were greedy or cruel. The problem was structural. Even a kind capitalist had to exploit workers or be driven out of business by competitors. The system itself demanded exploitation. You couldn't fix it by reforming it or by appealing to people's better nature. You had to overthrow it entirely and replace it with a different mode of production, where workers collectively own the means of production. This is crucial to understanding Marx. He didn't think the problem was primarily about ideas or values or consciousness. Those things mattered, but they were secondary. They were part of what he called the superstructure, the realm of culture and politics and ideology that sat on top of the economic base. Change the base and the superstructure would change too. Keep the base the same and all your cultural reforms would be superficial. When Nietzsche looked at the same world, he saw a completely different problem. Yes, people were suffering, but they had always suffered. What bothered Nietzsche wasn't suffering itself, but how people interpreted their suffering. They had been taught to see suffering as something bad, something to be eliminated, something that proved the world was unjust. This teaching came from Christianity, but it had outlived Christianity. Even as people stopped believing in God, they kept the Christian moral framework. They still believed in equality, in compassion for the weak, in the idea that suffering was evidence of wrongness that needed to be corrected. They still had what Nietzsche called slave morality. Slave morality was Nietzsche's term for a value system created by the weak as a weapon against the strong. Unable to dominate physically or politically, the weak had won a victory at the level of values. They had convinced everyone, including the strong, that strength was bad, that ambition was sinful, that the highest virtues were humility and self-sacrifice and concern for others. This was a brilliant move, from a certain perspective. It was how the powerless gained power, but it had poisoned European culture. It had created a civilization that celebrated mediocrity, that pulled down excellence, that made people ashamed of their own vitality and strength. It had created what Nietzsche called the last man, a type of human being who wanted nothing more than comfort and security and the approval of others. The problem wasn't economic structures. The problem was values, meanings, the stories people told themselves about what made life worth living. And the deepest problem was that these values were life-denying. They said no to existence. They saw the world as something to be escaped or transcended rather than affirmed. So where Marx diagnosed alienation from labor, Nietzsche diagnosed alienation from life itself. Where Marx saw exploitation, Nietzsche saw the victory of resentment. Where Marx wanted to overthrow capitalism, Nietzsche wanted to overthrow the entire moral framework that made people interpret their existence as suffering that needed to be eliminated. Notice how different these diagnoses are. If you're Marx, the solution is clear. Change the economic system, abolish private property, give workers control of production, create a society where labor is freely chosen and its fruits are fairly distributed. Do this and alienation ends. If you're Nietzsche, that solution is worse than the disease. It's still operating within slave morality. It's still saying that the problem is inequality, that the goal is to make everyone comfortable, that we should organize society around the weakest rather than the strongest. It's still denying life in favor of an imagined future where suffering has been eliminated. For Nietzsche, Marx was part of the problem. Marxism was just Christianity without God, the same resentment of the powerful, the same promise of future redemption, the same will to make everyone equal. It was slave morality in economic form. For Marx, Nietzsche's entire project would have seemed like a distraction at best, a justification for oppression at worst. Talking about values and meanings while people were starving, celebrating strength and power while workers were being ground down, that wasn't philosophy, that was ideology in the service of the ruling class. But here's what's fascinating. Both of them thought they were getting at something deeper than morality. Marx didn't think he was making a moral argument when he critiqued capitalism. He thought he was doing scientific analysis. The point wasn't that exploitation was wrong in some abstract sense. The point was that it was contradictory, unsustainable, that it created the conditions for its own abolition. Nietzsche also insisted he was beyond morality, beyond good and evil. He wasn't saying that strength was good and weakness was bad in the conventional moral sense. He was trying to understand how different types of human beings created different value systems based on their relation to power and life. So they were both trying to get beneath conventional moral categories, but in opposite directions. Marx was trying to show that moral ideas were effects of economic causes. Nietzsche was trying to show that supposedly objective truths, including economic truths, were expressions of particular configurations of will and value. This creates a dizzying interpretive problem. When Marx says capitalism is exploitative, is that a scientific claim or a moral claim? He would say scientific, but the entire analysis seems to rest on a moral intuition that stealing someone's labor is wrong. When Nietzsche says slave morality is life-denying, is that a factual claim or a value judgment? He would say factual, but the entire analysis seems to rest on a value commitment to life affirmation. Maybe both of them are doing something more complex. Maybe they're both trying to show that what we take as natural or inevitable is actually historical and changeable. Marx shows that capitalism, which seems like the natural order, is actually a specific historical formation with a beginning and an end. Nietzsche shows that Christian morality, which seems like universal truth, is actually a specific perspective that serves specific psychological needs. But they differ utterly on what to do with this insight. Marx wants to use it to build a new economic system based on human needs rather than profit. Nietzsche wants to use it to free exceptional individuals from the tyranny of collective values. The diagnosis shapes everything that follows. If the problem is economic, you need economic solutions, collective action, revolution, redistribution. If the problem is cultural or psychological or spiritual, you need individual transformation, new values, creative self-overcoming. And both of them would say, get the diagnosis wrong and your cure will make things worse. Marx would say that Nietzsche's emphasis on individual transformation leaves the economic structures in place. So nothing really changes except that some people feel better about their own superiority. Nietzsche would say that Marx's emphasis on economic transformation leaves the slave morality in place, so you just get a new form of resentment and leveling. For Marx, history wasn't just one thing after another. It had a pattern, a logic, a direction. This was one of his core insights, borrowed and transformed from Hegel. History moved through stages, each with its own economic base and corresponding superstructure. Primitive communism gave way to slave societies, which gave way to feudalism, which gave way to capitalism, which would give way to socialism, and eventually communism. Each stage emerged from the contradictions of the previous stage. Feudalism developed productive forces that couldn't be contained within feudal relations of production. The rising bourgeoisie needed free labor, needed markets, needed a different legal and political structure, so they made revolutions, they overthrew kings, they created capitalism. But capitalism itself was creating the conditions for its own overthrow. It was concentrating workers in factories, teaching them to cooperate, giving them shared interests as a class. It was developing productive forces to such a degree that scarcity could be overcome. It was making the irrationality of private property more and more obvious. The working class would eventually become conscious of its historical role and seize control of production. This wasn't just hope or prediction. Marx thought it was scientific certainty. History had laws like physics had laws. You could study the economic base of a society and predict its future development. The details might vary, the timeline might shift, but the overall trajectory was clear. Capitalism would fall, socialism would rise. Humanity would finally enter the realm of freedom. Notice what this means. Suffering has a purpose. The misery of workers under capitalism isn't meaningless. It's part of a process. It's creating the agent of revolutionary change. The worse things get, the closer we are to transformation. History is progressive, moving from less freedom to more freedom, from less developed productive forces to more developed ones, from societies based on exploitation to societies based on cooperation. This gives meaning to struggle. When workers organize, when they strike, when they fight for better conditions, they're not just trying to reduce their own suffering. They're participating in a world historical process. They're agents of progress. Their individual actions connect to a much larger story. Nietzsche found this entire framework absurd. History didn't have a direction. It didn't have a purpose. It certainly wasn't progress toward greater freedom or justice or rationality. Those were just stories people told themselves to make existence bearable, to give meaning to suffering, to avoid confronting the fundamental nature of reality. What was the fundamental nature of reality? Will to power. Everything that exists seeks to preserve and enhance its power. This isn't a moral claim, it's a metaphysical one. It's how the universe works. And this will to power doesn't have a goal, it doesn't lead anywhere, it just is, eternally creating and destroying, rising and falling. Human history reflected this. Cultures rose when they were vital, when they affirmed life, when they created new values. They fell when they became decadent, when they denied life, when they clung to old values that no longer served vitality. But this wasn't progress. There was no guarantee that what came after would be better. You could have decline, degeneration, the victory of weaker forms over stronger ones. In fact, that's exactly what Nietzsche thought was happening in his own time. European civilization was in decline. Christian morality had won, and in winning it had sapped the vitality from culture. Democracy, socialism, all the modern movements were symptoms of this decline, expressions of slave morality, the revenge of the weak against the strong. And it would keep happening. This was Nietzsche's doctrine of eternal recurrence. Everything that has happened will happen again, infinitely. Time is circular, not linear. The same configurations of forces will eventually recreate themselves. There is no final state, no endpoint, no redemption. This sounds horrifying, and Nietzsche knew it sounded horrifying. That was part of the point. Could you affirm life even knowing that everything would repeat eternally? Could you want your life to recur again and again exactly as it was? That was the test of whether you had truly overcome slave morality, whether you could say yes to existence without needing to believe in progress or improvement or meaning. So Marx offers a story where history has direction and purpose, where suffering now will lead to liberation later, where collective action can transform the world. Nietzsche offers a story where history has no direction, where there are only cycles of rise and fall, where the only meaning is what we create through our own affirmation of life. For someone suffering in a factory in Victorian England, which story is more appealing? Marx says your suffering matters. It's part of a great transformation. You and your fellow workers will inherit the earth. Nietzsche says your suffering doesn't matter in any cosmic sense. History isn't on your side, but you could potentially transform yourself into something higher. It's not hard to see why Marxism became a mass movement and Nietzsche remained obscure until after his death. Marxism gave people hope based on historical inevitability. Nietzsche offered a kind of aristocratic individualism that seemed irrelevant to most people's actual lives. But there's something else going on. Marx's historical inevitability came with a catch. If history has laws, if the revolution will happen because of economic contradictions, then what role does human agency actually play? Are we just puppets of historical forces? Marx would say no, people make history, but they make it under conditions they don't choose. There's a tension here between determinism and agency that runs through all of Marxist thought. Nietzsche's denial of historical progress also has a catch. If there's no direction, no improvement, just eternal recurrence, then why struggle? Why try to create new values? Nietzsche would say, because that's what life is. That's what the will to power does. It creates and destroys regardless of any ultimate purpose. But this can feel like a kind of nihilism, even as Nietzsche insists he's the one overcoming nihilism. Here's where the theories start to mirror each other in strange ways. Marx thinks capitalism creates the conditions for its own overcoming through its internal contradictions. Nietzsche thinks slave morality creates the conditions for its own overcoming by eventually becoming so weak and life-denying that it collapses. Both think the present contains the seeds of its own transformation. Both think things will get worse before they get better. Both think there's a kind of necessity to how things unfold. But Marx thinks this necessity leads somewhere good. The dictatorship of the proletariat, the withering away of the state, the achievement of communism where each person contributes according to their ability and receives according to their needs. Heaven on earth, essentially, though he would hate that phrasing. Nietzsche thinks necessity doesn't lead anywhere in particular. The Übermensch might arise, new values might be created, but there's no guarantee. And even if they do arise, even if we get a renaissance of human greatness, it will eventually decay again. That's just how things are. So one philosophy says history is going somewhere good and we can help it get there. The other says history isn't going anywhere, but we can still create meaning through our own affirmation and self-overcoming. One is fundamentally optimistic about collective possibilities. The other is fundamentally pessimistic about everything except individual potential. What's strange is that both of them were responding to the same collapse of traditional meaning. When Nietzsche declared that God was dead, he wasn't celebrating. He was warning that European civilization had lost its foundation and didn't realize it yet. When Marx analyzed capitalism, he was showing how it dissolved all traditional bonds and values into the cash nexus. Both saw that the old world was dying. Marx thought a new world was being born from the corpse of the old one. The working class would create new forms of solidarity, new forms of meaning, new ways of organizing production and life. The death of the old world was necessary for the birth of the new. Nietzsche thought Europeans were stuck between worlds, no longer believing in God but still believing in Christian values like equality and compassion, unable to face the full implications of God's death. They needed to go through a period of nihilism, of recognizing that all values are human creations before new values could emerge. For Marx, meaning comes from being part of a historical process larger than yourself. For Nietzsche, meaning comes from creating your own values in defiance of historical process. For Marx, the future redeems the present. For Nietzsche, the present must be affirmed eternally without any redemption. These aren't just different theories. They're different experiences of time, different ways of inhabiting history, different forms of hope or its absence. Every worldview has to answer the question of suffering. Why do people suffer? Is suffering meaningful? Can it be eliminated? Should it be eliminated? Marx and Nietzsche gave radically different answers to these questions, and understanding their different answers helps explain why their philosophies led in such opposite directions. For Marx, suffering under capitalism had a specific cause, and that cause could be removed. Workers suffered because capitalists extracted surplus value from their labor. They worked longer than necessary to reproduce their own existence, and the extra value went to the capitalist as profit. This wasn't natural, it wasn't inevitable, it was a feature of a particular economic system. But Marx's analysis went deeper than just exploitation in the workplace. He identified multiple forms of suffering under capitalism. There was material poverty, yes, but there was also alienation from one's own human potential. Capitalism turned creative, social beings into isolated individuals competing against each other. It turned work, which should be the expression of human creativity, into mere drudgery to survive. It turned even human relationships into commodities. Everything was for sale. Everything had a price. The rich traditions of human culture were being dissolved, as Marx wrote, into the icy water of egotistical calculation. People were cut off from nature, from community, from any sense of producing something meaningful. The crucial point is that all of this suffering was unnecessary. It existed because of how production was organized, because a small class controlled the means of production and used that control to exploit everyone else. Change the organization of production, and you could eliminate not just poverty, but alienation, not just material deprivation, but spiritual impoverishment. This is why Marx is often read as fundamentally optimistic despite his dark analysis of capitalism. The suffering he describes is terrible, but it's historical, not metaphysical. It has a beginning and it can have an end. Communism would be a society where people finally controlled their own productive activity, where labor was freely chosen rather than forced by necessity, where abundance replaced scarcity. In this future society, suffering wouldn't be eliminated entirely. People would still experience loss, illness, death, but they wouldn't experience the specifically social forms of suffering created by exploitation and alienation. They would be free to develop their full human potential. As Marx wrote, in communist society, nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch they wish. Nietzsche saw the problem of suffering completely differently. Suffering wasn't something to be eliminated, it was fundamental to life. Growth required resistance. Strength emerged from overcoming obstacles. A life without suffering would be a life without meaning, without achievement, without excellence. The problem wasn't suffering itself, but how people interpreted suffering. Christian morality had taught people to see suffering as evil, as evidence that the world was wrong, as something to be pitied and eliminated. This interpretation turned suffering into resentment. If suffering is wrong, then whoever causes suffering is evil. If I suffer, someone must be to blame. This was the psychological move that created slave morality. The weak couldn't overcome their suffering through strength, so they reinterpreted it as virtue. They said that suffering made them good, that their weakness was actually moral superiority, that those who didn't suffer were evil oppressors. Christianity universalized this interpretation. It made suffering sacred. It said, "Blessed are the meek, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the poor in spirit." It promised that those who suffered in this life would be rewarded in the next. It turned resentment into a cosmic principle. But modernity had kept this interpretation even as it lost belief in the afterlife. Socialism, democracy, humanitarian reforms, all of these movements were still operating within the Christian framework. They still saw suffering as wrong, still wanted to eliminate it, still judged society by how it treated its weakest members. For Nietzsche, this was backwards. A healthy culture would affirm suffering as necessary for greatness. It would honor those who overcame obstacles rather than pitying those who were overcome by them. It would seek excellence rather than equality, height rather than breadth, the exceptional rather than the average. This doesn't mean Nietzsche celebrated cruelty or wanted people to suffer pointlessly. His point was more subtle. He thought that trying to eliminate all suffering would eliminate the conditions for human greatness. It would create a comfortable but mediocre existence. It would produce what he called the last man who has invented happiness and blinks. The last man experiences no great suffering but also no great joy. He wants security, comfort, the approval of others. He has made everything small. This was Nietzsche's nightmare vision of where modern egalitarian movements were leading. Not to liberation, but to universal mediocrity. So where Marx saw suffering as a solvable problem, Nietzsche saw it as an inescapable feature of existence that could be approached in healthy or unhealthy ways. The healthy approach was amor fati, love of fate. You affirmed your suffering as necessary for who you became. You wanted it that way because without it you wouldn't be yourself. Think about how different these orientations are. If you're a worker in a factory, Marx tells you that your suffering is caused by exploitation and can be ended through revolution. Your suffering has a political meaning and a political solution. Nietzsche tells you that suffering is part of life, and the question is whether you can transform it into something that makes you stronger. Marx's approach connects you to others. Your suffering is shared with your class. Together you can overthrow the system that causes it. Collective action is both possible and necessary. Nietzsche's approach isolates you. Your suffering is your own. What matters is how you interpret it, what you make of it, whether you can overcome it through your own will. For Marx, compassion for those who suffer is appropriate because their suffering is unjust and unnecessary. For Nietzsche, pity is dangerous because it affirms the sufferer's interpretation of their suffering as something wrong, something that makes them victims. This creates a stark ethical divide. Marxism leads naturally to social movements aimed at reducing suffering, to labor unions and welfare states and redistribution. Nietzsche's philosophy seems to lead to indifference to others' suffering, or worse, to celebrating it as a test of strength. But both of them would reject a simple emphasis on reducing suffering as the highest goal. Marx would say that's too limited. The goal isn't just less suffering, but positive freedom, creative self-realization, the full development of human potential. Nietzsche would say that making the reduction of suffering the highest goal is itself an expression of slave morality, that it makes weakness the measure of all things. Here's another way to put it. Marx thinks certain kinds of suffering are wrong because they're imposed by unjust social structures. Nietzsche thinks calling suffering wrong is itself a moral error that prevents you from fully affirming life. Marx wants to change the world to eliminate suffering. Nietzsche wants to change how we interpret suffering so we can affirm the world as it is. Neither of them would be satisfied with just making people comfortable. That's important to understand. They're both radical thinkers who want transformation, not adjustment. But Marx's transformation is collective and external, changing society. Nietzsche's transformation is individual and internal, changing consciousness. And this connects to their different understandings of what it means to be free. For Marx, you're not free if you're forced by material necessity to sell your labor to survive. Freedom requires changing those material conditions. For Nietzsche, you're not free if you're enslaved by inherited values and moral categories. Freedom requires changing your relationship to those values. One freedom is social and economic. The other is psychological and spiritual. One requires revolution. The other requires self-overcoming. One is achieved collectively. The other is achieved individually. When Marx talked about the people, he had a very specific group in mind. The proletariat, the working class, those who owned nothing but their labor power and had to sell it to survive. This wasn't everyone. It wasn't humanity in general. It was a particular class defined by its relationship to the means of production. And this class had a special role in history. Because the proletariat owned nothing, because it was completely separated from the means of production, its liberation would require the abolition of private property itself. You couldn't have a free proletariat in a society still based on private ownership of production. So when workers freed themselves, they would have to free everyone. Their particular class interest aligned with universal human interest. This was Marx's brilliant move. He took the Enlightenment idea of universal humanity and grounded it in a specific class with specific material interests. The proletariat wasn't revolutionary because of their ideas or values, but because of their objective position in the economic structure. They were the class that had no property to preserve, the class that could only liberate itself by abolishing the conditions of its own existence as a class. And they were growing. Capitalism was constantly proletarianizing more people, forcing artisans and small property owners into the working class, concentrating them in ever larger factories. It was creating its own gravediggers, as Marx wrote. The bigger and more organized the working class became, the closer revolution came. So the people, for Marx, were fundamentally collective. Individual workers mattered only as part of this class. Their consciousness was important, but it was class consciousness that mattered, the recognition of shared interests and shared enemies. The point wasn't to achieve individual freedom, but to achieve collective power. This had real implications. It meant that individual desires or ambitions that conflicted with class interests were suspect. It meant that class struggle took priority over other forms of human difference or identity. It meant that the Communist Party, as the organized vanguard of the working class, could claim to represent true popular interests even against what actual people said they wanted. Nietzsche had a very different concept of who mattered. Not the masses, not the people as a collective, but exceptional individuals who could rise above the herd. Most people, most of the time, were what Nietzsche called the herd or the rabble. They followed conventions, accepted inherited values, cared mainly about comfort and security, and fitting in. This wasn't an insult exactly, or rather, it was descriptive before it was evaluative. Most people are not capable of creating new values. They need to be told what to believe, what to value, how to live. They need tradition and custom and authority, and that's fine for them. Nietzsche wasn't trying to liberate the masses. He was interested in the few who could become something higher, the potential overmen, those who could create their own values rather than accepting them from religion or society. These individuals were rare. They emerged unpredictably. They couldn't be mass-produced through social programs or education. And they required inequality. They required a society with enough hierarchy and difference that exceptional individuals could develop. A completely equal society would be a completely mediocre society. It would have no peaks, only a flat plane of sameness. So where Marx saw the people as the proletariat, a class that would abolish class society, Nietzsche saw the people as the herd that would always need to be led. Where Marx believed in collective liberation, Nietzsche believed in individual self-overcoming that required most people to remain unliberated. Democracy for Marx was incomplete. Bourgeois democracy was a form of class rule dressed up as popular sovereignty. But real democracy, where workers controlled the state and the economy, was both possible and desirable. The dictatorship of the proletariat was more democratic than bourgeois democracy because it represented the majority against the minority. Democracy for Nietzsche was the political expression of slave morality. It assumed everyone was equal, everyone's opinion mattered equally, everyone deserved the same rights and respect. This was precisely the leveling he opposed. Democracy was ruled by the mediocre for the mediocre. This is where Nietzsche becomes most disturbing to modern readers. His critique of democracy sounds elitist, aristocratic, even proto-fascist, and his ideas were indeed appropriated by fascists, though in ways he would have hated. Nietzsche despised German nationalism, anti-Semitism, mass movements of any kind. He wasn't advocating for an actual political aristocracy, but he was absolutely serious about hierarchy being necessary for human excellence. He thought that trying to make everyone equal would drag everyone down. He thought that compassion for the weak, which seemed humane, was actually preventing the emergence of anything truly great. For Marx, this was ideology pure and simple. Nietzsche's celebration of inequality was just a sophisticated rationalization for ruling class interests. Of course, the powerful would want to justify their power as natural or necessary or conducive to greatness. That's what ruling classes always did. For Nietzsche, Marx's emphasis on equality was resentment pure and simple. Of course, the weak would want to drag down the strong, would want to call exploitation what was really just the natural difference between the capable and the incapable. That's what slave morality always did. Each thought the other was expressing a particular class perspective while claiming to speak universal truth. And they were both right about that. Marx spoke from and for the propertyless. Nietzsche spoke from and for individual genius alienated from mass society. Their philosophies reflected their positions. But there's more going on. Marx's focus on the proletariat came from an analysis of capitalism's internal logic. He wasn't just siding with the poor against the rich. He was arguing that capitalism created a class whose liberation required systemic transformation, that this transformation was both necessary and possible, that it would benefit humanity as a whole. Nietzsche's focus on exceptional individuals came from an analysis of cultural health and decline. He wasn't just siding with the strong against the weak. He was arguing that cultures are created by exceptional individuals, that these individuals require certain conditions to emerge, that modern egalitarianism was destroying those conditions. So it's not just a matter of different values or preferences. It's different analyses of what makes societies thrive, what makes progress possible, what human beings need to flourish. Marx thought they needed material security and collective control. Nietzsche thought they needed challenge and hierarchy and the freedom to become unequal. In practice, Marxist movements created parties and unions and revolutionary organizations aimed at mobilizing the working class. Nietzschean ideas influenced artists and intellectuals and individual seekers who wanted to overcome conventional morality. One created collective institutions, the other inspired personal quests, and both visions have dark possibilities. Marxism's emphasis on class interest and collective action led to authoritarianism when parties claimed to represent the true interests of the people against the people's stated wishes. Nietzsche's emphasis on individual greatness led to justifications of cruelty and domination when his ideas were stripped of nuance. But both also inspired genuine liberation. Marxism gave workers a language to understand their exploitation and tools to fight it. Nietzsche gave individuals permission to question inherited values and create their own meaning. The question is whether these goods require the accompanying dangers, whether you can have Marx's solidarity without his authoritarianism or Nietzsche's individual freedom without his elitism. Marx believed he had discovered something fundamental, that beneath all the apparent chaos and variety of human history, there was a pattern, and that pattern was economic. The way societies organized production determined everything else. The mode of production was the base, and law, politics, religion, philosophy, art were the superstructure built on that base. This wasn't crude determinism exactly. Marx knew that ideas could influence economic development, that there was reciprocal interaction between base and superstructure. But in the end, when conflicts arose, economics won. You couldn't have feudal political institutions with capitalist production. You couldn't have communist culture with capitalist economics. The base determined the range of possibilities for the superstructure. This gave Marx and Marxists a powerful analytical tool. When you wanted to understand any social phenomenon, you asked, what are the economic conditions that produce this? Whose material interest does this serve? Romantic love, individual rights, the nuclear family. These weren't natural or universal, but reflected capitalist social relations. Change the economic base, and these forms would change too. Religion was the opium of the people, but not because priests were deliberately deceiving workers. Religion reflected real suffering while providing illusory compensation. It would persist as long as the material conditions that produced suffering persisted. Eliminate exploitation and religion would wither away, not through persecution but through irrelevance. The same logic applied to politics. Parliamentary democracy wasn't government of the people, but government of the bourgeoisie. It provided formal equality while preserving real economic inequality. Revolutionary change required not just political reform, but economic transformation. Take control of the means of production and political power would follow. This economic focus had strategic implications. The point of revolutionary activity was to organize workers around their economic interests, to build class consciousness, to prepare for the seizure of state power and the transformation of property relations. Cultural work mattered only insofar as it served these goals. Nietzsche inverted this entire framework. For him, economics was superficial, a symptom rather than a cause. What really drove history was values, meanings, interpretations. Different types of human beings created different value systems, and these value systems shaped what societies did, including how they organized production. The rise of capitalism wasn't caused by developments in productive forces. It was caused by the Protestant ethic, by a particular configuration of values around work and wealth and self-denial. As Max Weber would later argue, following Nietzschean insights, modern rational capitalism emerged from religious culture, not the other way around. More fundamentally, what mattered about any society was whether it was ascending or declining, healthy or sick, life-affirming or life-denying. And you could tell this by looking at its culture, its art, its values, not its economic statistics. A society could be wealthy and dying, poor and vital. The crucial question was always, what type of human being does this culture produce? So where Marx saw economic exploitation as the fundamental problem, Nietzsche saw cultural nihilism. Where Marx wanted to change property relations, Nietzsche wanted to transvalue values. Where Marx thought culture reflected economics, Nietzsche thought economics reflected culture. For Nietzsche, Marx's entire project was trapped within the value system of slave morality. The very categories Marx used, exploitation and justice and equality, already accepted the premise that the weak should define the terms. A truly radical critique would question whether suffering was unjust, whether equality was desirable, whether the perspective of the propertyless should determine how we judge society. Marx would reply that Nietzsche's cultural analysis was ideology masking real material interests. Talk about values and meanings was fine for professors and artists, but it changed nothing about who owned the factories and who worked in them. You could revalue values all you wanted. Workers would still be exploited. Capitalists would still extract surplus value. The system would still have its internal contradictions. But Nietzsche had a devastating response. Look what happens when you change the economic system in the name of equality. You get a new form of slave morality, state-enforced mediocrity, the persecution of excellence in the name of justice. The Russian Revolution would prove his point, though it happened after his death. Change the economics while keeping the underlying values, and you just get a new form of the same disease. Here's the deep question. Which is more fundamental, the economic or the cultural? Do values reflect material interests, or do material interests reflect values? Is consciousness determined by social being, or is social being determined by consciousness? Marx says consciousness is determined by social being. How you think, what you value, what seems natural to you, all of this reflects your position in the social relations of production. Capitalists and workers have different consciousnesses because they have different relationships to capital. Nietzsche says social being is determined by consciousness. How society is organized reflects the dominant value system, which reflects the type of human beings who created or accepted it. Capitalism exists because certain values, certain ways of interpreting the world became dominant. In practice, both are probably right about different things at different times. Economic structures do shape consciousness. People who live under capitalism tend to internalize capitalist values. But values also shape economic behavior. The Protestant work ethic did help create capitalism. Cultural revolutions can change what people think is possible or desirable. But acknowledging both doesn't resolve the conflict. If you have limited time and energy, if you're trying to change the world, where do you focus? Do you organize workers or do you write philosophy? Do you build unions or create art? Do you fight for economic justice or for cultural transformation? Marxism chose economics. It built labor movements, political parties, revolutionary organizations. It won real material improvements for workers. It also often produced rigid economism, dismissing questions of meaning and culture as bourgeois distraction. Nietzschean ideas influenced cultural avant-gardes, artistic movements, individual seekers. They produced new forms of art and thought. They also often produced aesthetic elitism, indifference to material suffering, contempt for ordinary people. The tragedy is that both analyses were partial. Marx was right that economic structures shape possibilities. You can't have certain forms of culture without certain material bases. But Nietzsche was right that values matter, that how we interpret our conditions affects what we do about them, that economic change without cultural change might just recreate the same problems in new forms. Contemporary debates often replay this split. Is the fundamental problem capitalism, or is it problematic values and ideologies? Do we need to redistribute wealth or change consciousness? Are economic class divisions primary, or are cultural divisions around race, gender, sexuality equally or more important? These questions don't have simple answers because Marx and Nietzsche were both grappling with real tensions. Economics does matter. Culture does matter. The question of which is more fundamental might be the wrong question. Maybe they're different dimensions of the same reality, and effective change requires working on both. But that kind of synthesis was impossible for Marx and Nietzsche. They were too certain of their opposing insights. Marx was sure that changing the base would transform the superstructure. Nietzsche was sure that cultural regeneration had to come first. Each thought the other was dangerously wrong. Both Marx and Nietzsche were atheists. Both saw religion as a human creation rather than divine revelation. Both wanted to understand what function religion served and why it persisted. But their analyses led in completely opposite directions. Marx's famous formulation was that religion is the opium of the people. But the full quote is worth hearing. Religious suffering is at one and the same time the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. This is more sympathetic than the truncated version suggests. Marx isn't just dismissing religion as false consciousness or priestly deception. He's saying that religion expresses genuine suffering while providing illusory compensation. People turn to religion because their actual conditions are so miserable that they need an imaginary happiness to make life bearable. The flowers on the chains, as he put it. Religion makes oppression tolerable by promising reward in the afterlife, by giving meaning to suffering, by providing community and comfort. It's not that religious people are stupid, it's that they're responding rationally to intolerable conditions. When this world is hell, belief in heaven makes sense. But this makes religion fundamentally conservative. It reconciles people to their suffering rather than inspiring them to change the conditions that cause suffering. It displaces hopes and desires onto an imaginary future rather than mobilizing people to fight for real improvement now. The priest might not consciously intend this, but the effect is to stabilize an unjust social order. For Marx, this meant that attacking religion directly was pointless. The young Hegelians spent their time critiquing religion philosophically, showing that God was a human projection. Fine, Marx said, but that changes nothing. Religion will persist as long as the material conditions that produce it persist. Create a society where people aren't suffering, where they have real control over their lives, where they don't need imaginary compensation, and religion will wither away on its own. The criticism of religion is therefore the criticism of the Valley of Tears, whose halo is religion. Criticism must abandon the flowers on the chains, not so that people will wear chains without fantasy, but so that they will throw off the chains. The point wasn't atheism for its own sake, but the creation of material conditions that would make religion unnecessary. Nietzsche's analysis was completely different and far more scathing. For him, Christianity wasn't just a symptom of suffering, but an active force that had poisoned European civilization. It wasn't opium that dulled pain, but a virus that had infected humanity's value system. His genealogy of morals traced Christianity back to what he called a slave revolt in morality. The Jews, powerless under Roman domination, couldn't defeat Rome through force, so they won a victory at the level of values. They inverted the Roman value system, turning everything upside down. The Romans valued strength, nobility, power, pride. The Jews said no, actually weakness is good, humility is virtuous, the meek will inherit the earth, the last shall be first. This was brilliant as a survival strategy. It was how the powerless gained power, but it was motivated by resentment, by hatred of the strong. It said no to life, no to this world, yes only to an imaginary afterlife where cosmic justice would reverse all earthly hierarchies. Christianity universalized this slave revolt. It took Jewish resentment and made it the framework for all of Western civilization. It taught people to be ashamed of their bodies, their desires, their strength. It made suffering sacred and happiness suspicious. It created the bad conscience, turning human aggression inward so that people tortured themselves with guilt. And the catastrophe was that this value system had won. Even as people stopped believing in God, they kept the Christian moral framework. They still believed in equality, in compassion for the weak, in judging the powerful as evil. Socialism, democracy, humanitarianism, these were all just Christianity without God. Same resentment, same will to make everyone small and equal, same denial of life. For Nietzsche, religion wasn't a response to material suffering, but a cause of spiritual suffering. Christianity had made Europeans sick. It had created a culture that said no to instinct, to power, to excellence. It had turned healthy human beings into guilt-ridden, self-hating, life-denying creatures who valued nothing higher than equality and comfort. So where Marx saw religion as something that would disappear once material conditions improved, Nietzsche saw Christian values as something that had to be actively destroyed even as belief in God faded. The death of God wasn't enough. Europeans needed to recognize what God's death meant, that all values were human creations, that nothing was sacred or given, that everything could be revalued. This revaluation was Nietzsche's great project, not just atheism but the creation of new values beyond good and evil, beyond slave morality, values that said yes to life, that affirmed strength and creativity and difference, that didn't seek to make everyone equal but celebrated the heights human beings could reach. Notice how different these projects are. Marx wants material transformation that will make religious consolation unnecessary. Nietzsche wants cultural transformation that will destroy religious values and create new ones. Marx thinks religion is a symptom that will disappear when the disease is cured. Nietzsche thinks religion is the disease itself. For Marx, focusing on religion and morality is a distraction from real change. For Nietzsche, changing material conditions without changing values is pointless and possibly dangerous. You'll just get slave morality in a new form. Both of them saw Christianity as central to understanding European civilization, and both wanted to move beyond it. But they differed completely on what Christianity was, why it mattered, and how to overcome it. Marx analyzed Christianity sociologically and economically. What class interests did it serve? How did it function to preserve the existing order? His answers: it served ruling class interests by making the oppressed accept their oppression, and it would persist until the oppressed seized power and created new conditions. Nietzsche analyzed Christianity psychologically and genealogically. What type of human being created these values? What will to power did they express? His answers: weak, resentful people created Christianity as a weapon against the strong, and it would persist until stronger types created new values. The practical implications diverged sharply. Marxists could be indifferent to religion as long as the economic struggle continued. Some Marxist movements persecuted religion, but the sophisticated position was that religion would wither under communism. You didn't need to fight it directly. Nietzscheans had to fight Christianity directly, had to attack the value system at its roots, had to show people that their most cherished beliefs about good and evil, justice and mercy, were expressions of a life-denying perspective. This was cultural warfare, not economic redistribution. And both analyses had truth in them. Marx was right that religion often functions to reconcile people to suffering, that it can be a conservative force, that material conditions affect belief. Nietzsche was right that Christian values shaped European culture profoundly, that those values persisted even as religious belief declined, that simply changing economic systems wouldn't automatically change the underlying value structure. Contemporary secular culture bears this out. In Western societies, very few people literally believe in Christianity anymore, but Christian moral assumptions about equality, compassion, human rights persist. Is this what Marx predicted, religion withering while humane values remain? Or is it what Nietzsche feared, slave morality continuing to dominate even without its theological foundation? The question matters because it determines what kind of critique makes sense. If religious values are good but religious metaphysics is false, then secularization is progress. If religious values are themselves problematic, then secularization hasn't gone nearly far enough. Marx represents the first position, Nietzsche represents the second, and we're still living in the tension between them. Still arguing about whether secular humanism is progress beyond religion or just religion in disguise, whether values like equality and universal human dignity are achievements or symptoms, whether compassion is a virtue or a weakness. Both Marx and Nietzsche were fundamentally concerned with human potential, with what human beings could become if certain conditions were met. They weren't just analyzing the present, they were imagining the future, but the future humans they imagined could hardly have been more different. For Marx, the future human was the communist human, someone who had finally overcome alienation and achieved genuine freedom. Under capitalism, people are forced into narrow roles. You're a factory worker, or a shopkeeper, or a landlord, and your entire life is defined by this economic function. You become what the system needs you to be. But in communist society, as Marx described it in the German ideology, nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch they wish. Society regulates the general production and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic. This vision of the all-around individual, the person who can develop multiple capacities rather than being trapped in specialized labor, was Marx's answer to alienation. Communist humans wouldn't be cogs in a machine. They would be creative, self-directed beings who chose their activities freely. And they would be social in a new way. Capitalism makes people compete against each other. Your gain is my loss. We're isolated individuals in a war of all against all, mediated by markets. Communist humans would recognize their interdependence. They would produce collectively and share collectively. The old opposition between individual and society would dissolve because individual flourishing would require social cooperation. This new human would also be free from material want. Marx believed that capitalism was developing productive forces to the point where scarcity could be overcome. With rational planning and collective ownership, society could produce abundance. The communist motto, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, would become possible when production had advanced far enough. So the future human would be versatile rather than specialized, cooperative rather than competitive, abundant rather than scarce. This wasn't utopian dreaming for Marx, it was scientific prediction. Capitalism was creating the conditions for this transformation. The point was to help it along, to organize the working class to seize power and reorganize production. Nietzsche's future human, the Übermensch or Overman, was almost the opposite in every respect. Not the average person developed to their full potential, but the exceptional individual who rises far above the average. Not someone produced by new social conditions, but someone who creates themselves through will. The Overman hasn't appeared yet. Humanity so far has produced only hints and anticipations. Nietzsche thought the ancient Greeks at their peak might have approached it, that the Renaissance had produced some approximations. But modernity was moving in the wrong direction, toward the last man rather than the Overman. The last man is Nietzsche's nightmare vision of the democratic, egalitarian future. People who want nothing more than comfort and security, who have made everything small, who blink and say, "We have discovered happiness." They have their little pleasures for the day and their little pleasures for the night, but they have a regard for health. No more dangerous living, no more striving, no more risk. The Overman would be the opposite, someone who could bear great suffering in pursuit of great achievement, someone who created their own values rather than accepting them from religion or society. someone who said yes to life in all its cruelty and beauty, who could bear the thought of eternal recurrence and still affirm existence. This wasn't about political power or social position. An overman could be poor and obscure. What mattered was internal sovereignty, the ability to give style to one's character, to make of one's life a work of art. It was about intensity of experience, depth of thought, creativity of spirit, and the overman would be rare. Most people couldn't achieve this. They needed to be led, needed conventional morality and social rules. That was fine. Nietzsche wasn't trying to produce universal overmen. He was trying to clear the way for the few who could achieve greatness by destroying the moral framework that hindered them. So where Marx imagined a future where everyone achieved their full potential through social transformation, Nietzsche imagined a future where a few achieved extraordinary heights through individual transformation. Where Marx wanted to raise the bottom, Nietzsche wanted to raise the top. Marx's future human is collective. The individual achieves freedom through participation in collective production, through recognition of social interdependence. The community makes individual development possible. Nietzsche's future human is solitary. The overman achieves freedom through separation from the herd, through rejection of collective values. Society is something to overcome, not something to perfect. For Marx, the future human would be more rational, more conscious of the laws governing social development, able to plan production collectively rather than being at the mercy of market forces. Reason would finally be able to shape society according to human needs. For Nietzsche, the future human would be beyond rationalism, recognizing that reason is just one tool among others, not the highest human capacity. The overman would integrate all aspects of human nature, reason but also passion, Apollonian clarity but also Dionysian frenzy. Rationalism was part of the sickness, another form of saying no to life. Marx's vision inspired mass movements because it promised something for everyone. You didn't need to be exceptional. You just needed to be part of the working class, part of the collective struggle. Your individual limitations didn't matter. Together, workers could transform the world. Nietzsche's vision couldn't inspire mass movements because it explicitly rejected the masses. It spoke only to those few who felt capable of something higher, who experienced conventional morality as a constraint rather than a guide. It was inherently elitist. But there's something else happening in these visions. Both of them are reactions to modernity's tendency to make human beings smaller. Capitalism does reduce people to economic functions, does create specialized, limited, alienated beings. Democratic mass society does tend toward conformity, toward mediocrity, toward the lowest common denominator. Marx and Nietzsche both saw this clearly. They both wanted human beings to be bigger, fuller, more alive, but they had opposite theories about how to achieve it. Marx thought you needed to change the system, give people material security and free time, eliminate exploitation and alienation, create conditions where they could develop multiple capacities, make society rational and just, and individuals would flourish. Nietzsche thought you needed to change the individual, destroy slave morality, create new values, affirm life without need for external validation or cosmic justice, make individuals sovereign, and they would create new forms of society. One is bottom-up transformation through collective action. The other is top-down transformation through individual achievement. One trusts the masses. The other trusts only rare individuals. In practice, attempts to create Marx's future human through communist societies often produced conformity and mediocrity, the very things he was trying to overcome. Central planning could be as alienating as capitalism. Collective ownership didn't automatically create versatile, free individuals. In practice, attempts to create Nietzsche's overman often produced cruelty and elitism. When his ideas were appropriated politically, they justified domination rather than inspiring genuine self-creation. The emphasis on strength and hierarchy led to violence against the weak. Neither vision was realized in anything like its pure form, but both continued to inspire. The Marxist vision of a society beyond alienation, where labor is creative and shared, where people develop their full potential, still animates socialist movements. The Nietzschean vision of individuals who create their own values, who live intensely and authentically, still speaks to those who feel constrained by conventional morality. The question is whether these visions can be combined or whether they're fundamentally incompatible. Can you have a society that enables both collective flourishing and individual greatness? Or do you have to choose between equality and excellence, between community and solitude, between raising the bottom and raising the top? Power was central to both thinkers, but they understood it in fundamentally different ways. For Marx, power was social and political, something exercised by classes over other classes. For Nietzsche, power was metaphysical and psychological, the fundamental drive of all existence. Marx's analysis of power was materialist. Power came from control of the means of production. In feudal society, lords had power because they controlled land and could extract labor from serfs. In capitalist society, the bourgeoisie had power because they owned factories and could employ or not employ workers. This power wasn't primarily about violence or coercion, though those played a role. It was structural. Workers had to sell their labor to survive. Capitalists could buy that labor below its full value. This relationship produced surplus value, which accumulated as capital, which gave capitalists more power to employ more workers and extract more surplus value. The state was an instrument of class power. It might appear neutral, might claim to represent everyone, but in reality, it enforced property relations that benefited the ruling class. Laws against theft protected capitalist property. Police and courts suppressed working-class organization. The entire legal and political superstructure served to maintain the economic base. Revolutionary power meant seizing the state apparatus and using it to transform property relations. The dictatorship of the proletariat would be the working class using state power against the bourgeoisie, just as bourgeois democracy was the bourgeoisie using state power against workers. Once class divisions were eliminated, the state itself would wither away because there would be no more class rule to enforce. So power, for Marx, was something to be seized and reorganized. Workers needed to take power from capitalists collectively through revolution. Individual power meant nothing. What mattered was class power, organized power, the collective capacity to transform social relations. Nietzsche's concept of power was entirely different. The will to power wasn't something you seized, it was what you were. It was the fundamental drive of all living things, the basic force operating in all of existence. Everything that exists seeks to preserve and enhance its power. This wasn't a political claim primarily. It was a metaphysical claim about the nature of reality. From the smallest organism to the most complex civilization, everything was will to power expressing itself in different forms. Growth, development, creativity, these were all expressions of will to power. But will to power could take different forms, healthy or sick. Healthy will to power affirmed itself directly, created values, acted on the world. Sick will to power turned inward, expressed itself as resentment, created values that denied life. Master morality was healthy will to power, slave morality was sick will to power. And here's the crucial point. Will to power couldn't be abolished or redistributed. You couldn't create a society without hierarchy or domination because these were inherent to existence itself. You could only shift between healthy and unhealthy expressions of will to power. Socialism, democracy, all attempts to create equality were expressions of weak will to power. They were the weak trying to constrain the strong, trying to make everyone small. This wasn't overcoming domination. It was just a different form of domination, the tyranny of the herd over the exceptional individual. True power came from self-mastery, from the ability to create your own values and live by them. This required tremendous strength. Most people couldn't do it. They needed external rules, needed to be told what to value, needed authority, and that was fine. The point wasn't to give everyone power, but to enable those capable of genuine power to achieve it. Notice how opposed these conceptions are. Marx says power is social, can be redistributed through collective action, should be wielded by the previously powerless. Nietzsche says power is individual, is fundamentally unequal, should be wielded by those capable of greatness. For Marx, talking about individual will to power while ignoring economic structures is mystification. It doesn't matter how strong your will is if you don't own the means of production. Real power is material, social, collective. For Nietzsche, talking about seizing state power while remaining within slave morality is pointless. You'll just create a new form of resentment-based society. Real power is psychological, cultural, individual. The political implications are obvious and stark. Marxism leads to revolution, to workers organizing collectively to seize control of the economy. Success is measured by changes in property relations and class power. Nietzscheanism leads to individual self-overcoming, to artists and philosophers creating new values. Success is measured by cultural transformation and personal achievement. But both recognized that power in their sense was hard to achieve. Marx knew that building class consciousness, organizing workers, making revolution was difficult. Most people accepted their oppression as natural. Most revolutionary attempts failed. The ruling class had enormous resources to maintain its power. Nietzsche knew that achieving self-mastery, creating new values, becoming an overman was almost impossible. Most people would always be herd animals. The cultural forces supporting slave morality were immense. Very few could overcome them. So both offered a kind of heroic struggle against long odds. For Marx, it was the struggle of the working class against capitalism. For Nietzsche, it was the struggle of exceptional individuals against herd morality. Both required tremendous effort with no guarantee of success, and both thought their opponents were dangerous. Marx thought Nietzsche's individualism served ruling class interests by distracting from collective struggle. Talk about will to power and self-overcoming while workers starved seemed like the height of bourgeois ideology. Nietzsche thought Marx's collectivism was the ultimate expression of slave morality. Using state power to enforce equality would destroy all possibility of human greatness. It would create a world of last men, comfortable and small. Contemporary politics still operates in this tension. Movements on the left emphasize collective action, redistribution of resources, social power. Movements on the right often emphasize individual responsibility, personal excellence, natural hierarchy. Both claim to be anti-establishment but in opposite ways. The deep question is whether these are actually incompatible. Can you seek both collective empowerment and individual achievement? Can a society be both egalitarian and excellent? Or are these fundamentally opposed values that force you to choose? Marx would say yes, they're compatible because genuine individual development requires collective empowerment. You can't develop your full potential while being exploited and alienated. Remove those constraints through social transformation and individuals will flourish. Nietzsche would say no, they're opposed because collective empowerment means reducing everyone to the lowest common denominator. The masses don't want excellence. They want comfort and conformity. Enable them and you destroy the conditions for greatness. Both of them might be partly right. Social conditions do constrain individual development. But social transformation doesn't automatically produce individual excellence. We still don't have a good answer to how societies can enable both collective well-being and individual greatness. Every revolutionary philosophy has to grapple with violence. If you want to fundamentally transform society and the existing order won't give up power peacefully, what then? Marx and Nietzsche had very different answers to this question. Marx was unambiguous about revolutionary violence. It was necessary. The ruling class would never surrender its privileges voluntarily. History showed this clearly. Every major transformation in human society involved violent struggle. The bourgeois revolutions against feudalism were violent. The coming proletarian revolution against capitalism would be violent too. This wasn't celebration of violence for its own sake. Marx wasn't interested in bloodshed as such, but he was grimly realistic about power. Those who benefit from the existing system will use every means available to preserve it. They control the state, the police, the military. They will kill to maintain their position. Workers have no choice but to fight back. The violence of revolution is response to the ongoing violence of exploitation. Capitalism kills workers through dangerous conditions, malnutrition, preventable disease. It just does so quietly, through economic mechanisms rather than open force. Revolutionary violence makes visible the hidden violence of the system. The dictatorship of the proletariat would necessarily involve suppressing the bourgeoisie. You couldn't have a successful revolution if you allowed the old ruling class to sabotage it, to fund counter-revolution, to use their remaining wealth and connections to undermine the new society. Temporary repression was necessary for lasting liberation. Marx distinguished between the violence of the oppressed and the violence of the oppressor. The first was progressive, breaking chains, opening possibilities. The second was reactionary, maintaining domination, closing possibilities. They weren't morally equivalent even if both involved coercion and blood. This logic would have terrible consequences in practice. Communist revolutions justified extraordinary violence against class enemies. Millions died. The temporary dictatorship became permanent. The suppression of the bourgeoisie expanded to suppression of anyone deemed counter-revolutionary. Emergency measures became normal politics. But Marx himself never advocated violence for its own sake. He believed revolution would usher in a fundamentally better society, that the violence would be transitional. Once class divisions were eliminated, once everyone benefited from collective ownership, coercion would no longer be necessary. The state would wither away. Nietzsche's relationship to violence was more complex and more disturbing. He didn't advocate political violence directly. He wasn't calling for revolution or war, but his entire philosophy celebrated struggle, conflict, domination. The will to power necessarily involved overcoming resistance, subduing opposition, asserting strength. His critique of Christianity emphasized how it had made Europeans weak and pacifistic. It had taught them to turn the other cheek, to value meekness, to see violence as inherently wrong. This was slave morality denying the fundamental nature of existence. Life was violent. Growth required destruction. Creativity required tearing down what existed before. Master morality, the value system of the strong, didn't see violence as wrong. It saw strength as good, and strength often involved domination. The noble warrior didn't agonize over killing enemies. He did what was necessary without bad conscience, without guilt. Nietzsche's praise for ancient cultures often emphasized their martial virtues. The Greeks valued war and competition. The Romans built an empire through conquest. The Renaissance princes were ruthless and creative. These were healthier cultures than modern democratic society with its emphasis on peace and equality. But Nietzsche wasn't simple militarism. He distinguished between healthy and unhealthy forms of violence. Healthy violence was direct, creative, what the strong did to overcome obstacles. Unhealthy violence was reactive, born of resentment, what the weak did out of hatred. Revolutionary violence, from this perspective, was unhealthy. It was the violence of slaves against masters, born from resentment and envy. It didn't create anything new. It just tore down those who had achieved greatness. The French Revolution, for Nietzsche, was a disaster that empowered the rabble and destroyed nobility. So Nietzsche wouldn't support Marx's revolutionary violence. He would see it as sick will to power, the weak using violence to drag down the strong, to enforce equality. This was worse than the violence of the strong because it was life-denying rather than life-affirming. But this left Nietzsche with no political program. If you opposed revolution but recognized that modern society was sick, what should you do? Nietzsche had no answer. His work spoke to individuals seeking self-transformation, not to movements seeking social change. This political quietism, combined with his rhetoric celebrating strength and struggle, made Nietzsche's work dangerously appropriable. Fascists and other right-wing movements would claim him, would use his celebration of violence and hierarchy to justify their own brutality. Nietzsche would have hated this, but his own words enabled it. The contrast with Marx is instructive. Marx's embrace of revolutionary violence came with a clear political project and a vision of the future that would justify the violence. You fight now to create a world without exploitation, without violence, without the need for force. The violence is instrumental, not fundamental. Nietzsche's aesthetic appreciation of violence, combined with his rejection of progress and future utopias, offered no such redemption. Violence was part of life, part of the will to power, something that would recur eternally. You couldn't justify it in terms of a better future because there was no better future, only the eternal return of the same struggles. Both philosophies tried to get beyond conventional morality about violence. Marx said you can't judge revolutionary violence by abstract moral standards. You have to understand it historically, see it as necessary for liberation, distinguish it from reactionary violence. Nietzsche said, you can't judge any violence by slave morality standards. You have to understand it as expression of will to power, see whether it's creative or reactive, distinguish healthy from sick forms. But both ended up producing justifications for extraordinary violence. Marxist revolutions killed in the name of historical necessity. Fascist movements killed in the name of strength and vitality. Neither philosophy provided adequate constraints on violence once you accepted its core premises. The deeper problem is that both rejected liberal morality's emphasis on individual rights and limits on power. For Marx, individual rights were bourgeois ideology masking class rule. The collective good of the working class trumped individual protections. For Nietzsche, rights were slave morality trying to protect the weak from the strong. Both created frameworks where enormous violence could be rationalized. Contemporary movements still struggle with these questions. When is violence justified? How do you distinguish legitimate resistance from illegitimate aggression? Can revolutionary violence create lasting peace, or does it just cycle into new forms of oppression? Marx offers one answer. Violence is justified when it serves collective liberation, when it breaks structures of exploitation. It's transitional, necessary only until the new society is established. Nietzsche offers another. Violence is fundamental to existence, not good or bad in itself, but expressive of healthy or sick will to power. Neither answer is satisfying. Both contain dangerous possibilities. But both were trying to think honestly about power and change in a world where the existing order maintained itself through violence, where transformation seemed impossible without force. If there's one issue where Marx and Nietzsche stand in absolute opposition, it's equality. This isn't a minor disagreement about tactics or emphasis. It's a fundamental split about what human beings are and what societies should aim for. Marx believed in equality as both a moral principle and a historical destiny. Not equality in the weak sense of everyone being treated the same under capitalism, which was formal equality masking real inequality, but substantive equality, where class divisions were eliminated and everyone had equal access to the means of life. The communist slogan, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, captured this. People have different abilities, yes, but this doesn't justify inequality in consumption or power. Someone stronger or more talented doesn't deserve more. Distribution should be based on need, not on contribution or merit. This was radical egalitarianism. It meant abolishing not just legal inequality, but economic inequality, not just discriminatory treatment, but differential outcomes. Under communism, there would be no rich and poor, no powerful and powerless, no class divisions of any kind. Marx grounded this in his analysis of human nature. Human beings were social, cooperative, capable of recognizing their common interests. The apparent selfishness and competition under capitalism wasn't natural human nature, but a product of scarcity and private property. Remove those and people would naturally cooperate as equals. Class struggle had progressively expanded equality through history. Each revolution gave more people more rights, more voice, more power. The bourgeois revolution expanded equality beyond the aristocracy. The proletarian revolution would complete the process by eliminating the last class division. Equality wasn't just fair, it was necessary for freedom. You couldn't be free if others had power over you. You couldn't develop your capacities if you lacked resources others monopolized. Freedom and equality were inseparable. A free society had to be an equal society. Nietzsche viewed all of this with horror and contempt. Equality was the fundamental principle of slave morality. It was what the weak demanded when they couldn't achieve excellence themselves. It was the ultimate expression of resentment, the ultimate no to life. Nature isn't equal. Some organisms are stronger, faster, more complex than others. This isn't injustice, this is reality. The will to power produces hierarchy necessarily. Everything seeks to dominate what it can and resist domination by what's stronger. This creates ranks, orders, differences. Human beings are profoundly unequal. Some are capable of great creativity, profound thought, intense experience. Most are not. Some can create values. Most need to follow values created by others. Some are strong enough to stand alone. Most need the security of the herd. Trying to make everyone equal means pulling down the higher to the level of the lower. It means preventing exceptional individuals from achieving their potential because that would create inequality. It means organizing society around the needs and capabilities of the weakest. Democracy, socialism, all egalitarian movements were symptoms of cultural decline. They represented the victory of the weak over the strong, the herd's revenge against individual excellence. They created tyranny of the majority, rule by the mediocre for the mediocre. The good society for Nietzsche would be explicitly hierarchical. It would recognize that humans are unequal and organize itself accordingly. It would cultivate excellence rather than equality. Would give exceptional individuals the conditions they needed to create greatness, even if this meant most people remained subordinate. This wasn't just about social organization, it was about values. Egalitarianism taught people to measure everything by whether it served the average, whether it made everyone comfortable. This prevented anyone from achieving height. It made all peaks into plains. A healthy culture would measure itself by its peaks, by the highest human achievements it produced, not by how well it treated the weakest members. Ancient Athens mattered because of Socrates and Plato, not because of how average Athenians lived. The Renaissance mattered because of Da Vinci and Michelangelo, not because of social welfare. Marx would call this exactly what it appears to be: ideology serving ruling class interests. Of course, the powerful want to justify inequality. Of course, they want society organized to serve excellence, meaning their own excellence. This is just rationalization of exploitation. The truly free society wouldn't have Übermenschen and herd. It would have individuals developing their full potential in cooperation with each other. The opposition between exceptional individual and collective wasn't natural. It was produced by class society, where some people monopolized resources and opportunities while others were stunted. Nietzsche would call Marx's egalitarianism exactly what it appears to be: resentment of the capable by the incapable. Of course, the weak want to call inequality unjust. Of course, they want to drag everyone down to their level. This is just slave morality, trying to constrain life. The debate can't be resolved because they're operating from fundamentally different premises about human nature and value. Marx thinks human inequality is mostly environmental, product of material conditions. Change those conditions and you'll find that humans are basically equal in potential. Nietzsche thinks human inequality is fundamental, inherent in the nature of life itself. You can't eliminate it without eliminating life. Marx thinks equality is the precondition for freedom and flourishing. Nietzsche thinks equality is the death of freedom and flourishing. Marx thinks the goal should be raising everyone up. Nietzsche thinks the goal should be enabling the few who can reach great heights. In practice, egalitarian movements did improve conditions for many people. Labor movements won better wages, safer conditions, more leisure. Welfare states reduced poverty and suffering. These were real achievements that Marx would celebrate. But they didn't produce the flourishing Marx predicted. Communist states that enforced equality created bureaucratic mediocrity, cultural stagnation, repression of individual initiative. They became exactly what Nietzsche feared, societies organized around the lowest common denominator. Meanwhile, societies that maintained hierarchy and inequality did produce innovation and excellence in some domains. They also produced the poverty and suffering Marx diagnosed. The exceptional individuals Nietzsche celebrated often depended on exploiting those below them. Maybe both Marx and Nietzsche were right about what they opposed and wrong about what they proposed. Marx was right that inequality under capitalism causes immense suffering. Nietzsche was right that enforced equality can suppress excellence. But Marx's solution didn't work, and Nietzsche's non-solution justified oppression. Contemporary debates about equality often replay this divide. Should we prioritize equality of outcomes or excellence and innovation? Should we measure society by how we treat the worst off or by our highest achievements? Is inequality natural or social? Can you have both justice and greatness? These questions don't have easy answers because Marx and Nietzsche each identified something real. Societies do need both justice and excellence. Both care for the vulnerable and space for the exceptional. But their philosophies made these seem mutually exclusive. Marx thought equality would enable excellence by giving everyone resources to develop. Nietzsche thought hierarchy was necessary for excellence even at the cost of equality. One prioritized the many over the few, the other prioritized the few over the many. Neither framework adequately addresses the problem of how to create societies that are both just and dynamic, both equitable and excellent. We're still searching for synthesis. Marx considered himself a scientist. He didn't think he was doing philosophy in the traditional sense, offering one perspective among many. He thought he had discovered objective laws governing human society, laws as real and verifiable as the laws of physics or biology. Capital was meant to be for political economy what Darwin's Origin of Species was for biology, a rigorous scientific explanation of how the system actually worked. This scientific ambition shaped everything about Marx's method. He spent years in the British Museum reading economic data, factory reports, parliamentary investigations. He built mathematical models of surplus value extraction. He traced historical patterns across different modes of production. He was looking for regularities, for patterns, for laws. The law of value, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, the increasing concentration of capital, these weren't moral judgments or philosophical speculations. They were supposed to be empirical discoveries about how capitalism functioned. You could test them against evidence. You could make predictions based on them. This gave Marxism tremendous rhetorical and political power. If you're offering a scientific analysis rather than a moral critique, you can claim inevitability. It's not just that capitalism is unjust and should be overthrown. It's that capitalism contains contradictions that will inevitably destroy it. The revolution isn't something we merely want. It's something that will happen based on objective historical laws. Marx drew explicitly on Hegel's dialectic, but claimed to have made it materialist and scientific. Hegel thought contradictions in ideas drove history. Marx showed that contradictions in material conditions drove history. Thesis and antithesis weren't abstract concepts, but real social forces, bourgeoisie and proletariat. Forces of production and relations of production. The point wasn't just to interpret the world, but to change it, as Marx wrote in his theses on Feuerbach. But to change it effectively, you needed to understand it scientifically. Revolutionary practice required revolutionary theory. You couldn't make a revolution based on wishful thinking or moral outrage. You needed rigorous analysis of how capitalism worked and how it could be overthrown. This scientific self-understanding had another implication. It meant that Marxism could claim to transcend ideology. Other perspectives were ideology, distorted reflections of class interests. But Marxism was science, objective knowledge of social reality. The proletariat was the universal class whose interests aligned with truth itself. Nietzsche attacked this entire framework from the ground up. There were no objective laws of history. There was no such thing as pure scientific truth independent of perspective. The very idea that truth was the highest value was itself a value judgment that needed to be questioned. His perspectivism was radical. All knowledge is interpretation from some point of view, serving some interest, expressing some configuration of will to power. There's no view from nowhere, no God's eye perspective, no access to things as they are in themselves independent of how they appear to us. This wasn't simple relativism, the claim that all perspectives are equally valid. Some perspectives are stronger, more comprehensive, more life-affirming than others. But there's no escaping perspective. Even science, which claims objectivity, reflects particular values. The will to truth, the desire for prediction and control, the preference for mechanistic explanations. The will to truth itself was suspicious. Why do we value truth so highly? Nietzsche suggested it came from slave morality, from the weak person's need to understand and predict the world because they can't simply dominate it. The strong don't need truth, they create reality through their actions. Science, from this view, wasn't neutral investigation of objective reality. It was one perspective among others, one way of interpreting the world that served certain interests and values. It was useful for technological control, for predicting and manipulating nature, but it wasn't the whole truth about existence. In fact, Nietzsche thought science was fundamentally life-denying. It reduced everything to mechanism, stripped away meaning and value, turned the living world into dead matter following mathematical laws. Scientific materialism was the final consequence of Socratic rationalism and Christian otherworldliness, the complete devaluation of this world. For Nietzsche, Marx's scientific socialism was just another form of the ascetic ideal, the will to truth turning against life itself. Marx thought he was being materialist and scientific, but he was actually still operating within Christian Platonic assumptions about objective truth and historical progress. The very idea that history had laws, that you could predict its course scientifically, presumed a rational structure to reality that Nietzsche rejected. History didn't follow laws. It was the interplay of forces, the rise and fall of cultures, the eternal struggle of different configurations of will to power. So where Marx claimed scientific objectivity, Nietzsche insisted on perspectival interpretation. Where Marx built elaborate theories claiming to reveal the hidden laws of society, Nietzsche offered aphorisms and genealogies showing how what seems natural or necessary is actually historical and contingent. This created fundamentally different relationships to their own ideas. Marx believed he had discovered truth and that this truth demanded practical action. If capitalism really does contain contradictions leading to crisis, if the working class really is the revolutionary agent, then you know what must be done. Nietzsche believed he was offering one perspective, though a particularly penetrating one. His ideas weren't meant to ground political programs. They were meant to free individuals from the tyranny of supposedly objective truths. They were therapeutic, not scientific. But there's a tension in both positions. Marx claimed to be doing science, but his analysis was saturated with value judgments. The very concept of exploitation presumes a moral framework. The idea that alienation is bad requires some vision of human flourishing. Science can't tell you what should be, only what is. Marx would respond that he's describing objective contradictions and their objective consequences. Whether you think exploitation is good or bad, it still leads to class struggle and eventual revolution. The science doesn't depend on moral judgments, but this doesn't quite work. Why focus on these contradictions rather than others? Why assume that class struggle leads to progress rather than mere chaos? Why think the working class will become conscious of its interests rather than remaining fragmented? These aren't purely empirical questions. Nietzsche had his own tension. If all perspectives are equally perspectival, if there's no truth beyond interpretation, why should we accept his perspective? Why is his genealogy of morals more insightful than Christian morality's account of itself? Nietzsche would respond that he's not claiming absolute truth, just a more comprehensive perspective, one that includes its own perspectival nature rather than denying it. His view is stronger because it's more honest, more life-affirming, more aware of what it's doing. But this risks collapsing into simple assertion. My perspective is better because I say it's more life-affirming, but life affirmation is itself a value that Nietzsche asserts rather than proves. Someone operating from within Christian morality could equally claim their perspective is more life-affirming in a different sense. The debate about truth and science matters because it shapes what kind of arguments can work. If Marx is right that there are objective social laws, then we can have scientific debates about society. We can gather evidence, test theories, resolve disagreements through empirical investigation. If Nietzsche is right that all knowledge is perspectival, then we can't have that kind of debate. We can only offer different interpretations, show how they express different values, perhaps persuade others to adopt our perspective. But we can't prove anything in a strong sense. Contemporary philosophy and social science still operates in this tension. Most social scientists work within a broadly Marxist framework, assuming that there are real social structures that can be studied scientifically, that we can discover how societies actually work through empirical investigation. But postmodern theory, heavily influenced by Nietzsche, questions this entire enterprise. It shows how supposedly objective knowledge reflects power relations, how scientific claims serve particular interests, how truth itself is constructed rather than discovered. The stakes are high. If Marx is right, then we can have rational debates about the best social organization based on evidence about what works. We can adjudicate between competing claims. We can make progress in understanding society. If Nietzsche is right, then all such debates are ultimately about values and perspectives, not facts. There's no neutral ground for adjudication. Power and persuasion matter more than evidence and logic. Both were reacting against German idealism's grandiose claims about absolute knowledge. Both were trying to bring philosophy down to earth, but Marx brought it down to material conditions and scientific analysis. Nietzsche brought it down to psychology and genealogy. For Marx, the path forward required better science, more rigorous analysis, clearer understanding of social laws. For Nietzsche, the path forward required abandoning the quest for absolute truth and learning to create values consciously. Art held completely different places in Marx's and Nietzsche's philosophies, and understanding this difference reveals something important about their entire worldviews. For Marx, art was part of the superstructure, ultimately determined by economic base. For Nietzsche, art was the highest human activity, the justification of existence itself. Marx rarely wrote about art systematically, but when he did, his framework was clear. Art, like all cultural production, reflected the economic conditions of its time. Greek tragedy emerged from slave society. Renaissance painting emerged from early capitalism. Each mode of production generated its characteristic art forms. This didn't mean art was simply propaganda for ruling classes. Marx had a more sophisticated view. Art could transcend its immediate conditions, could capture universal human experiences even while reflecting particular historical moments. Greek sculpture remained beautiful even though the social conditions that produced it had vanished. But art couldn't escape its material foundations entirely. Artists needed patrons, needed materials, needed time freed from productive labor. The very categories of artist and artwork were historical, not natural. In communist society, the opposition between artistic and non-artistic work would dissolve. Everyone would have opportunity for creative expression. Marx imagined that under communism, art would flourish in new ways. No more artists starving in garrets, no more creative work subordinated to market demands. People could paint or write or compose as part of their freely chosen activities, not as specialized careers. Art would become integrated into life rather than separate from it. But this meant art had no special priority. It was one form of human creativity among others, no more important than other freely chosen activities. The point wasn't to produce great artworks, but to enable universal creative development. Nietzsche placed art at the absolute center of his philosophy. His first book, The Birth of Tragedy, argued that Greek tragedy represented the highest human achievement, a perfect fusion of Apollonian form and Dionysian ecstasy. Art wasn't reflection of economic conditions. It was direct expression of the fundamental forces of existence. The famous line from that early work, "Only as an aesthetic phenomenon is existence and the world eternally justified. Not morally justified, not rationally justified, aesthetically justified. Life is horrible, full of suffering and meaninglessness. Only art makes it bearable by transforming suffering into beauty." This aesthetic justification remained central to Nietzsche's mature work even as he developed beyond his early romanticism. Art was superior to both philosophy and science because it didn't claim to offer truth. It openly acknowledged that it created fictions, beautiful illusions that made life worth living. The artist was Nietzsche's model for the Übermensch, not the moral reformer or the political revolutionary, but the creator of new forms, new meanings, new values. Artists didn't discover truth or implement social programs. They created from nothing, imposed their vision on formless material, gave style to chaos. This made art fundamentally individual. Great art came from exceptional individuals, not from social movements or collective efforts. You couldn't democratize artistic genius. You couldn't create great art through better economic arrangements. You could only create conditions where exceptional individuals might emerge. And those conditions required hierarchy and inequality. Artists needed patrons, needed leisure, needed freedom from mundane concerns. The Renaissance flourished under corrupt princes, not democratic communes. Great art required a society willing to support non-productive creative work, even while most people labored. For Marx, this was exactly backwards. Making art dependent on patronage meant making it serve the tastes and values of the wealthy. Real artistic freedom required eliminating economic dependence on patrons or markets. Only when everyone had material security could genuine creativity flourish. For Nietzsche, Marx's vision would produce mediocrity. Democratic art, art for the masses, art serving political purposes. This wasn't real art. Real art was aristocratic, individual, excessive. It didn't serve social needs, it transcended them. The debate extends to what art should do. For Marx, insofar as he addressed this, art should serve progressive purposes. It should reveal social realities, inspire revolutionary consciousness, imagine better worlds. Even if art couldn't be reduced to politics, it could and should contribute to human liberation. Socialist realism would later embody this view crudely. Art should depict workers heroically, should inspire class struggle, should serve the party's goals. This wasn't quite what Marx envisioned, but it followed logically from making art part of the superstructure, serving base transformation. For Nietzsche, the idea that art should serve any external purpose was obscene. Art served itself. It created beauty, expressed life, transformed suffering into affirmation. The moment you made it instrumental, made it serve politics or morality or social reform, you destroyed what made it art. Art for Nietzsche was amor fati in aesthetic form. It said yes to existence without need for justification or redemption. It didn't promise a better future or critique an unjust present. It transformed the present into something that could be loved for its own sake. This created opposite relationships to tradition and innovation. Marx saw artistic tradition as something to be both preserved and transcended. The great works of the past should be accessible to everyone in communist society, but new forms would emerge from new social relations. Nietzsche revered certain traditions, especially ancient Greek culture and the Renaissance, but not because they were old, because they represented cultural health, moments when exceptional individuals created lasting beauty. Most tradition was dead weight, Christian democratic mediocrity that needed to be destroyed. Both would reject bourgeois art for art's sake aestheticism, but for opposite reasons. Marx because it divorced art from social reality and political engagement. Nietzsche because it made art into a commodity, something consumed by bored bourgeoisie rather than created by driven genius. The practical consequences differed sharply. Marxist movements tried to create working-class art, proletarian culture, politically engaged creativity. Sometimes this produced powerful work that illuminated social conditions. Sometimes it produced propaganda. Nietzschean influence produced modernist and avant-garde movements that rejected social utility, that celebrated the artist as individual creator beyond conventional morality. Sometimes this produced extraordinary innovation. Sometimes it produced self-indulgent elitism. Both struggled with the relationship between individual creativity and social context. Marx emphasized social determination but couldn't quite explain why some individuals in similar conditions produced great art while others didn't. Nietzsche emphasized individual genius, but couldn't quite explain why genius emerged in some periods and places, but not others. Contemporary debates about art still operate in this space. Should art serve social justice or transcend politics? Should it be accessible to masses or challenging to conventions? Should we judge it by political effects or aesthetic achievement? These aren't questions with clear answers because Marx and Nietzsche each identified something true. Art does reflect social conditions. It also transcends them through individual creativity. It can serve political purposes. It can also create beauty independent of utility. Neither framework fully captures what art is and does. Marx's materialism can't quite explain aesthetic power. Nietzsche's aestheticism can't quite escape the social conditions that enable art. We're still searching for synthesis. At the deepest level, Marx and Nietzsche disagreed about the basic unit of human existence. For Marx, individuals only made sense as parts of collectives, as members of classes, as social beings. For Nietzsche, collectives were abstractions, fictions imposed on the reality of individual existence. Marx's philosophy began from the premise that humans are social animals. We're not isolated atoms that then choose to form societies. We're constituted by our relationships, our position in social structures, our participation in collective labor. The individual self is produced by society, not prior to it. This wasn't just sociology, it was ontology, a claim about what humans fundamentally are. Consciousness itself is social, language is social, even our sense of being an individual self emerges from social interaction. Robinson Crusoe wasn't the natural human condition, he was already carrying society inside him. Therefore, individual freedom required collective transformation. You couldn't liberate yourself while leaving social structures unchanged. Your apparent individual choices were constrained by your class position, your access to resources, your options in the market. Real freedom meant transforming the collective conditions that determined individual possibilities. Class consciousness was recognition of this truth. Workers realizing that their individual problems had collective causes and required collective solutions. Solidarity wasn't sacrifice of individual interest for the group. It was recognition that individual interest and collective interest were identical. The communist future would abolish the opposition between individual and society. The old bourgeois individual, the competitive ego pursuing self-interest, would disappear. Not because individuals would be suppressed, but because the social conditions producing that form of individuality would be transformed. In a society of abundance and cooperation, where labor was freely chosen and its fruits shared, people would develop as genuine individuals rather than playing assigned social roles. But this individuality would be social through and through, recognizing interdependence rather than pretending to autonomy. Nietzsche started from the opposite premise. The individual came first. Society was a herd phenomenon, a lowest common denominator compromise among individuals who needed collective security because they couldn't stand alone. Real individuals, exceptional individuals, had to separate themselves from the collective. They had to overcome the social programming, the inherited values, the pressure to conform. Becoming yourself meant becoming unsocial, at least partially. This didn't mean literal isolation. Nietzsche had friends, corresponded with people, engaged with culture, but it meant psychological independence, the ability to create your own values rather than accepting collective norms. Most people couldn't do this. They needed the herd for security and meaning. The opposition between individual and collective wasn't something to be overcome through social transformation. It was fundamental, permanent. You were either someone capable of individual greatness, or you were part of the mass. These were different types of human being, not different class positions. Collective thinking was inherently mediocre. Committees, democracies, mass movements, all of these produced compromise and conformity. Great achievements came from individuals, artists, philosophers, warriors, creators who stood apart from and often against the collective. Therefore, society should be organized to enable exceptional individuals, even at cost to the collective. This wasn't because exceptional individuals were more valuable in some abstract sense. It was because they created all real value: art, philosophy, culture, meaning. The herd merely maintained itself. Marx would see this as the ultimate bourgeois ideology. The myth of the autonomous individual served to obscure actual social determination. It made people blame themselves for failing under capitalism rather than recognizing systemic constraints. It justified inequality by pretending some people were just naturally superior. The entrepreneur who claimed to be a self-made man ignored the workers whose labor created his wealth, the public infrastructure that enabled his business, the social conditions that produced his opportunities. Individual achievement was always collective in reality, even when it appeared individual. Nietzsche would see Marx's collectivism as slave morality's ultimate victory, making the collective primary, organizing society around collective needs, subordinating individual achievement to collective welfare. This was the herd's revenge against greatness. Marx promised liberation through collective action. Nietzsche promised liberation through individual self-overcoming. Marx said you were unfree because of economic structures. Nietzsche said you were unfree because of internalized collective values. For Marx, thinking in individual terms was false consciousness. You needed to understand yourself as part of a class, part of historical forces, part of collective struggle. Individual psychology was superficial compared to social position. For Nietzsche, thinking in collective terms was herd mentality. You needed to understand yourself as an individual will to power, creating your own meaning, affirming your own existence. Collective identity was superficial compared to individual becoming. The political implications were total opposites. Marxism led to building collective institutions, unions, parties, Soviets, collective farms. Success meant how well the collective was organized and mobilized. Individual concerns were subordinated to collective goals. Nietzscheanism led to cultivating individual autonomy, education, art, philosophy, personal transformation. Success meant how fully you achieved individual self-mastery. Collective movements were distrusted as leveling forces. In practice, Marxist collectivism often suppressed individuality brutally. Anyone who stood out, who questioned collective wisdom, who pursued individual excellence was suspect. Conformity was enforced in the name of solidarity. The collective became tyrannical. In practice, Nietzschean individualism often produced isolation and powerlessness. Without collective action, individuals couldn't change oppressive structures. Celebrating individual autonomy while ignoring social constraints served those who benefited from existing arrangements. Both extremes failed. Pure collectivism crushed human variety and creativity. Pure individualism ignored social reality and mutual dependence. But Marx and Nietzsche made these seem like absolute choices. Contemporary culture struggles with this tension constantly. We celebrate individual achievement while depending on collective institutions. We want personal freedom while needing social security. We value uniqueness while seeking belonging. Neither Marx nor Nietzsche offers adequate guidance for navigating this. Marx would dissolve the tension through social transformation, but his solutions produced conformity. Nietzsche would embrace the tension as permanent, but his solutions left most people powerless. Maybe both identified real human needs. We do need collective belonging and individual distinctiveness, social support and personal autonomy, cooperation and creativity. But their philosophies made these incompatible. The question remains, can societies enable both collective flourishing and individual excellence, or must we choose between them? Marx thought we could transcend the opposition. Nietzsche thought it was fundamental to existence. Neither convinced the other, neither convinced history. Despite their fundamental opposition, Marx and Nietzsche shared more than either would have admitted. Understanding their unexpected points of convergence reveals something important about what united 19th century radical thought even as it diverged. Both were thoroughgoing critics of bourgeois morality. They despised the comfortable middle-class values of their era: respectability, conventional piety, the pretense of virtue masking self-interest. They saw through the hypocrisy of a society that preached Christian charity while grinding workers into poverty, that celebrated individual liberty while enforcing rigid conformity. Marx called it ideology, the ruling ideas of the ruling class dressed up as universal truth. Nietzsche called it herd morality, the values of the mediocre enforced on everyone. Different terms for similar insight. Conventional morality served specific interests while claiming to be absolute. Both were atheists, but not of the simple Enlightenment variety that replaced God with reason. They understood that losing God was a catastrophe, not a liberation. Marx saw religion as necessary compensation for real suffering. Nietzsche saw God's death as removing the foundation of all meaning. Both knew you couldn't just subtract God and expect everything else to continue unchanged. They were both materialists in different senses. Marx was a historical materialist who thought economic conditions determined consciousness. Nietzsche was a naturalist who rejected any supernatural realm, any soul separate from body, any transcendent meaning beyond this world. Both insisted that explaining human life meant looking at earthly, material, bodily reality, not appealing to spirits or eternal forms. Both rejected liberal individualism's picture of isolated rational agents making free choices in markets. Marx showed how market freedom was illusory when you had to sell your labor to survive. Nietzsche showed how rational autonomy was illusory when your values came from social conditioning. Both saw through liberalism's self-understanding. They shared a genealogical method, though they applied it differently. Marx traced ideas back to material interests, showing how philosophical theories reflected class positions. Nietzsche traced moralities back to psychological types, showing how value systems reflected configurations of power. Both refused to take beliefs at face value, always asking, who benefits from this belief? What function does it serve? Both were historicists who rejected eternal truths about human nature. Marx insisted that human nature changed with modes of production. What seemed natural under capitalism was actually historical, contingent, changeable. Nietzsche insisted that moral values changed across cultures and epochs. What seemed universal was actually particular, perspectival, created. They both valued struggle and conflict over peace and harmony. Marx saw class struggle as the motor of history, the force driving social transformation. Without conflict between classes, society would stagnate. Nietzsche saw struggle as essential to growth, both individual and cultural. Without resistance to overcome, humans would become weak and complacent. Both despised pity and sentimental humanitarianism, though for different reasons. Marx thought bourgeois charity was a way of avoiding real change, of making exploitation tolerable through token kindness. Better to fight for justice than beg for compassion. Nietzsche thought pity affirmed weakness, made the sufferer into a victim rather than inspiring them to overcome. Better to admire strength than sympathize with failure. They shared contempt for utilitarianism and its calculation of pleasure and pain. Marx thought reducing human beings to pleasure seekers missed the deeper issue of alienation and self-realization. Nietzsche thought the utilitarian calculus reflected slave morality's obsession with comfort rather than greatness. Both wanted something bigger than maximizing happiness. Both were anti-democratic in their own ways. Marx saw bourgeois democracy as class rule disguised, formal equality masking real inequality. Parliamentary debates were theater while capitalists controlled the economy. Nietzsche saw democracy as mob rule, the masses enforcing mediocrity. Majority opinion was usually wrong because most people were incapable of independent thought. They both believed the present was a time of crisis and transition. Marx saw capitalism entering its final contradictions, heading toward revolutionary transformation. Nietzsche saw European civilization entering nihilism, the death of God creating an abyss that hadn't yet been recognized. Both thought their contemporaries were living in a decadent, dying order. Both valorized certain forms of violence or destruction. Marx saw revolutionary violence as necessary and progressive. Nietzsche celebrated creative destruction, the demolition of old values to make way for new ones. Both thought you couldn't build something radically new without tearing down what existed. They shared a certain ruthlessness about sacrifice for higher goals. Marx was willing to accept immense suffering in the present if it led to future liberation. The revolutionary transition might be brutal, but it was necessary. Nietzsche was willing to accept that most people would remain unfulfilled if that was the price of enabling exceptional achievement. Neither was sentimental. Both were intellectual aristocrats despite their different politics. They looked down on ordinary beliefs and popular opinions. They saw themselves as penetrating beneath surfaces that fooled others. Marx understood the hidden laws of capital. Nietzsche understood the hidden psychology of morality. Both claimed access to truths unavailable to common understanding. They both transformed German philosophy's abstract concepts into tools for analyzing concrete reality. Hegel had talked about contradictions and dialectics in pure thought. Marx and Nietzsche brought these ideas down to earth, made them about actual human life and society, though in very different ways. Both were prophetic in style, even while claiming to be scientific or genealogical. They announced what was coming: revolution for Marx, nihilism, and its overcoming for Nietzsche. They positioned themselves as seeing the future that others couldn't yet recognize. They demanded that readers transform their understanding completely. They shared enemies: Christianity, bourgeois society, conventional morality, liberal democracy, utilitarianism. These were targets for both. They agreed more on what to destroy than what to build, but their destructive energy came from similar sources: impatience with mediocrity, contempt for hypocrisy, commitment to radical honesty. Both valued authenticity over comfort. Marx wanted humans to face their real social conditions without religious or ideological illusions. Nietzsche wanted individuals to face existence without moral or metaphysical consolations. Both thought their contemporaries were lying to themselves, fleeing from reality into comforting fictions. They both believed in transformation rather than reform. Marx didn't want better capitalism, but its complete overthrow. Nietzsche didn't want improved Christian morality, but its total revaluation. Both were maximalists who rejected incremental change as insufficient. Both were willing to be unpopular, to speak uncomfortable truths, to develop ideas that alienated them from their societies. Marx lived in exile and poverty. Nietzsche lived in isolation and obscurity. Neither compromised their vision for acceptance or success during their lifetimes. They shared a certain joy in intellectual combat. Marx loved polemics, loved demolishing opponents with savage irony. Nietzsche loved overturning conventional wisdom, loved shocking respectable opinion. Both found pleasure in the intellectual struggle itself, and crucially, both were wrong in similar ways about what would happen next. Marx thought capitalism would collapse from its internal contradictions within decades. It didn't. Nietzsche thought European culture would descend into nihilism before revaluing values. Instead, it descended into world wars and totalitarianism that claimed both their names. Their shared failures reveal shared blindnesses. Both underestimated capitalism's adaptability, its ability to incorporate critique and continue. Both underestimated how their own ideas could be vulgarized and weaponized. Both thought the crisis they diagnosed would resolve in the direction they indicated. Instead, it produced outcomes neither predicted. But their agreements also reveal the extent of their disagreement. They agreed that bourgeois society was sick, but Marx thought the sickness was economic, and Nietzsche thought it was cultural. They agreed that transformation was necessary, but Marx wanted collective revolution, and Nietzsche wanted individual revaluation. They agreed that conventional morality was false, but Marx wanted proletarian morality, and Nietzsche wanted to transcend morality entirely. Even their shared materialism divided them. Marx's materialism made economics primary. Nietzsche's materialism made psychology primary. Both rejected idealism, but in opposite directions. Their agreements make their disagreements more profound, not less. They were close enough to be genuine alternatives, far enough apart to be irreconcilable. Someone convinced by their shared critique of bourgeois society still had to choose between Marx's and Nietzsche's solutions. Contemporary radical thought still operates in the space they created. We've inherited their shared critique of capitalism, conventional morality, and liberal democracy, but we're still divided along the fault line they established. Is the solution collective or individual, economic or cultural, revolutionary or transformational? The 20th century became, in many ways, a vast experiment in putting Marx's and Nietzsche's ideas into practice. The results were catastrophic in ways neither could have imagined, yet also revealed enduring power in their insights. The Russian Revolution of 1917 claimed Marx's name. Lenin and the Bolsheviks saw themselves as implementing Marx's scientific analysis of capitalism and his vision of proletarian revolution. They seized state power, abolished private ownership of the means of production, attempted to create the dictatorship of the proletariat that would transition to communism. But the reality diverged from Marx's vision almost immediately. Marx had thought revolution would happen in advanced capitalist countries, where the working class was large and organized. Russia was barely industrial, mostly peasant. Lenin adapted Marx's theory, arguing that a vanguard party could lead revolution even where conditions weren't fully mature. The Soviet Union claimed to be building Marx's communist society. It collectivized agriculture, industrialized rapidly, provided universal education and healthcare, eliminated unemployment. It mobilized millions in the name of creating the new socialist human. But it also created a totalitarian state that murdered millions, a bureaucratic elite that reproduced class divisions, a stagnant economy that couldn't provide basic goods, a culture of conformity and fear. Workers didn't control production. The state didn't wither away. Alienation took new forms. Was this Marx's fault? Defenders said no, that Stalin betrayed Marx's vision, that Soviet communism was a perversion of true Marxism. Critics said the seeds were in Marx's philosophy. The emphasis on class struggle justified violence against class enemies. The belief in historical necessity justified authoritarianism in service of progress. The subordination of individual rights to collective goals enabled totalitarianism. Communist revolutions spread across the world. China, Cuba, Vietnam, North Korea, Cambodia, each claiming Marx's legacy, each producing different forms of state socialism, most producing some combination of economic development and political repression. Hundreds of millions lived under governments claiming to implement Marxism. Even in capitalist countries, Marxism shaped labor movements, social democratic parties, academic disciplines. Marx's analysis of capitalism influenced economics, sociology, history. His emphasis on ideology and consciousness influenced cultural studies and critical theory. Whether you agreed with his solutions or not, you had to engage with his diagnosis. But by century's end, communist states were collapsing. The Soviet Union dissolved. China introduced markets. The revolutionary promise had failed to deliver on its predictions. Capitalism hadn't collapsed from internal contradictions. Workers in advanced countries hadn't become revolutionary. Communist societies hadn't produced abundance and freedom. Nietzsche's influence was more diffuse and more dangerous. He died in 1900, just as the new century began, his work still obscure. But within decades, his ideas were everywhere, often distorted beyond recognition. His sister Elizabeth, an anti-Semite and German nationalist, took control of his unpublished work after his mental collapse. She edited and arranged his notes to support her own political agenda. She presented Nietzsche as a proto-Nazi philosopher of German supremacy and racial purity, exactly what he had despised. The Nazis claimed Nietzsche. They loved his rhetoric about will to power, about master morality, about the need for hard men to overcome decadence. Hitler visited the Nietzsche archive. Nazi propaganda used his language. His Übermensch became their Aryan Superman. This was profound misappropriation. Nietzsche loathed German nationalism, called anti-Semitism a sign of cultural sickness, despised mass movements, valued cosmopolitan European culture. He would have hated everything the Nazis represented. But his rhetoric of strength and struggle, divorced from context, could be weaponized. Yet Nietzsche also influenced movements he would have appreciated. Existentialists like Sartre and Camus drew on his emphasis on individual meaning creation and rejection of transcendent values. They transformed his ideas into philosophies of human freedom and responsibility. Postmodernists like Foucault and Derrida extended his genealogical method and his critique of objective truth. They used his perspectivism to question all claims to neutral knowledge, to show how power operates through what counts as true. Artists and writers throughout the century drew on Nietzsche's aesthetic philosophy, his celebration of creativity, his idea that life itself could be a work of art. Modernist movements often reflected his influence even when they didn't cite him explicitly. Psychologists engaged with his insights about the unconscious, about how much of human motivation happens beneath awareness. Freud's theory of drives and sublimation owed debts to Nietzsche's psychology even as it differed in details. So Nietzsche shaped fascism through misappropriation, existentialism through genuine engagement, postmodernism through extension, and modernist culture through inspiration. His influence was everywhere but nowhere pure, always mediated through interpreters who used him for their own purposes. The tragedy is that both Marx and Nietzsche became associated with the century's worst horrors. Communist totalitarianism claimed Marx. Fascist totalitarianism claimed Nietzsche. Millions died in the name of ideas that were supposed to liberate humanity. Was this inevitable? Did their philosophies contain seeds of totalitarianism? Or were they betrayed by followers who understood them poorly? Marx's emphasis on class struggle and revolutionary violence did enable brutality. Once you believe you're on the right side of history, once you think you understand scientific laws of social development, it becomes easy to justify crushing those who stand in the way. The ends justify the means because the ends are historically necessary. His subordination of individual to collective made it hard to protect individual rights against collective goals. If the party represents the working class and the working class represents historical progress, then opposing the party is opposing history itself. Dissent becomes counter-revolution. But Marx also wanted human liberation, the end of alienation, creative flourishing for everyone. He would have been horrified by Stalinist purges, Chinese famine, Cambodian genocide. These weren't what he envisioned. Nietzsche's celebration of strength and hierarchy did enable cruelty. Once you believe that inequality is natural and necessary, that the strong should dominate the weak, that compassion is weakness, it becomes easy to justify terrible things. Might makes right because might is all there is. His contempt for democracy and equality made it hard to protect vulnerable people. If society should be organized around exceptional individuals, if most people are just herd animals, then their suffering doesn't matter much. Excellence justifies everything. But Nietzsche also wanted individual freedom, cultural vitality, honest engagement with existence. He would have been horrified by Nazi conformity, racial pseudoscience, mass violence. These weren't what he envisioned. The century revealed that ideas have consequences, but not always the consequences their originators intended. Marx wanted liberation and got gulags. Nietzsche wanted self-overcoming and got death camps. Both would have rejected what was done in their names. Yet both also shaped progressive movements. Marx inspired labor rights, welfare states, economic justice movements. His analysis of capitalism influenced regulations, unions, social programs that improved millions of lives. Even capitalist societies incorporated insights from Marx's critique. Nietzsche inspired individual liberation movements, questioning of conventional morality, artistic innovation. His ideas helped people break free from restrictive traditions, create new forms of life, think beyond inherited categories. Even collective movements used insights from Nietzsche's psychology. By century's end, crude Marxism and crude Nietzscheanism had both failed. Soviet communism collapsed. Fascism had been defeated, but subtle versions of both persisted. Neo-Marxist analysis of capitalism remained influential. Nietzschean perspectivism shaped intellectual culture. The 20th century proved that neither Marx's scientific laws nor Nietzsche's cultural transformation offered simple paths to human flourishing. Both had identified real problems. Neither had workable solutions, or rather their solutions, when implemented literally, produced disasters. This didn't mean their ideas were worthless. It meant they needed to be engaged critically, selectively, with awareness of dangers. You could use Marx's analysis of capitalism without accepting his theory of revolution. You could use Nietzsche's critique of morality without accepting his celebration of hierarchy. The question became, what was living and what was dead in Marx and Nietzsche? What insights remained valuable? What claims had been refuted by history? This question occupied thinkers throughout the late 20th century and continues today. Walk into any university humanities department, any political debate, any cultural controversy today, and you'll find arguments shaped by Marx and Nietzsche. Their conflict has become the deep structure of contemporary thought, often unrecognized by those repeating it. The left remains fundamentally Marxist in its analysis even when it doesn't use Marxist language. When activists talk about systemic racism or structural inequality, they're using Marx's method of looking beneath individual actions to identify structural causes. When they emphasize collective action and solidarity, they're drawing on Marxist traditions of organizing. Contemporary socialism has abandoned much of classical Marxism. Few people still believe in the dictatorship of the proletariat or the withering away of the state. But the core insight remains that capitalism creates unjust distributions of power and resources, that individual freedom requires collective transformation of economic structures, that we should judge society by how it treats the worst off. The language has evolved. Instead of proletariat, we say working class or precariat. Instead of surplus value, we talk about wage stagnation and inequality. Instead of revolution, we often talk about democratic socialism or social democracy. But the underlying framework is Marxist. Economic structures determine life possibilities. Collective action can change those structures. Justice requires redistribution. Climate activism draws heavily on Marx's analysis. The climate crisis is seen as a result of capitalist accumulation and profit-seeking. Solutions require challenging corporate power and transforming economic systems. Individual consumer choices aren't enough. We need structural change. This is Marx's method applied to environmental issues. Social justice movements use Marxist frameworks of oppressor and oppressed, structural power and collective resistance. Whether fighting for racial justice, gender equality, or LGBTQ rights, activists identify systems of domination and organize collective action to dismantle them. The categories have expanded beyond economic class, but the analytical method remains. Academic Marxism thrives even as political Marxism has declined. Critical theory, post-colonial studies, cultural studies all use Marx's emphasis on ideology and material interests. They ask, whose interests does this idea serve? What power relations does this institution maintain? How do economic structures shape culture? The right, meanwhile, remains fundamentally Nietzschean even when conservatives would be horrified by the connection. When they talk about personal responsibility and individual achievement, they're echoing Nietzsche's emphasis on self-creation. When they celebrate hierarchies as natural and necessary, they're drawing on his critique of equality. Contemporary libertarianism and individualism reflect Nietzschean themes. The entrepreneur as heroic individual creator, making something from nothing through will and vision. The emphasis on excellence over equality, on merit over need. The suspicion of collective action as mob mentality. These are Nietzschean ideas in economic form. Cultural conservatism often uses Nietzschean critiques of modern values. The emphasis on traditional virtues like strength and courage over modern values like empathy and inclusivity. The concern that equality leads to mediocrity. The belief that cultural decline comes from abandoning standards of excellence. These echo Nietzsche's diagnosis of nihilism. The self-help industry is thoroughly Nietzschean. It tells you that you can create yourself through will, that you should overcome obstacles rather than seek help, that you're responsible for your own meaning and success. The emphasis on mindset over circumstances, on personal transformation over social change, reflects Nietzschean individualism. Tech culture often embodies Nietzschean values even while using progressive language, the celebration of disruption and creative destruction, the belief in visionary founders versus bureaucratic systems, the emphasis on excellence and ambition over equality and fairness. Silicon Valley's ethos is remarkably Nietzschean despite surface progressivism. The culture wars reflect the Marx-Nietzsche divide. One side emphasizes collective identity, systemic oppression, the need for structural change. The other emphasizes individual merit, personal responsibility, the danger of group thinking. Both sides are usually unaware they're replaying 19th century debates. Contemporary debates about free speech show this clearly. The left, following Marx's analysis of ideology, argues that speech serves power, that some speech upholds oppression, that collective well-being justifies limiting harmful expression. The right, following Nietzsche's emphasis on individual creation, argues that free expression enables individual excellence, that collective limits threaten greatness. Arguments about equality versus excellence, diversity versus meritocracy, inclusion versus standards, all replay Marx versus Nietzsche. Should institutions prioritize equal outcomes or highest achievement? Should we judge them by how they treat the average or by their peaks? These are the same questions in contemporary form. Economic debates remain structured by this divide. Should we reduce inequality through redistribution or maximize growth through incentives? Is poverty primarily structural or individual? Do we need collective provision or individual opportunity? Marx said the first in each pair. Nietzsche said the second. Mental health discourse shows interesting synthesis and tension. Therapeutic culture borrows from both. It uses Nietzschean emphasis on individual meaning-making and self-creation, but it also increasingly uses Marxist analysis of how social structures create suffering. Some therapists focus on individual resilience, others emphasize systemic trauma. Identity politics represents attempted synthesis of Marx and Nietzsche. It uses Marxist analysis of power structures and collective oppression, but it often emphasizes individual identity and personal narrative in Nietzschean ways. It combines structural analysis with emphasis on individual experience and voice. This creates tensions. Is identity primarily collective or individual? Is the goal equality or authentic self-expression? Should we emphasize shared oppression or individual difference? These questions reflect unresolved Marx-Nietzsche conflicts. Debates about science and objectivity replay their epistemological divide. One side insists that science reveals objective truth independent of politics. The other insists that science reflects social power and interests. Marx and Nietzsche both question naive objectivity, but in different ways that still divide camps. Arguments about art and culture reflect their aesthetic divide. Should art serve social justice or transcend politics? Should we judge it by political impact or aesthetic achievement? Should culture be accessible or challenging? Progressives and conservatives often swap positions depending on whose culture is in question. Religious debates show their continuing relevance. The new atheists took a straightforward Enlightenment position, but more sophisticated discussions reference Marx on religion's social function and Nietzsche on values after God's death. Can we have meaning without transcendence? Do secular values depend on religious foundations? Even popular culture reflects this divide. Superhero movies show tension between collective action against systemic threats and individual heroes using exceptional abilities. Young adult fiction often features protagonists choosing between joining movements and maintaining individual identity. These narrative conflicts replay philosophical ones. The Marx-Nietzsche divide shapes how people experience modernity itself. Some see it as alienating because of capitalist exploitation. Others see it as stifling because of democratic mediocrity. Some want collective transformation, others want individual transcendence. Neither seems fully possible. Contemporary politics is polarized partly because both sides are partly right. The left correctly identifies structural barriers to flourishing. The right correctly identifies that collective action can suppress individual excellence. But neither has solutions that preserve both values. We're stuck with their question. Can society be both just and great, both equal and excellent, both collectively supportive and individually challenging? Or must we choose between Marx's egalitarian collective and Nietzsche's hierarchical excellence? Most people try to have both in different domains, Marxist about economics, Nietzschean about culture, or vice versa. But this creates incoherence. The values conflict, the analyses contradict. We haven't synthesized them, we just toggle between them. The urgent question is whether synthesis is possible or whether we're doomed to oscillate between collectivism and individualism, equality and hierarchy, structure and agency, Marx and Nietzsche. Throughout the 20th century, thinkers attempted to reconcile Marx and Nietzsche to combine their insights while avoiding their extremes. These attempts produced some of the century's most interesting philosophy. They also revealed how deep the incompatibility runs. Existential Marxism was perhaps the most sustained effort. Thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre tried to combine Marx's analysis of social structures with existentialism's emphasis on individual freedom and meaning creation. Sartre wanted to preserve both historical materialism and radical individual responsibility. His later work, especially the Critique of Dialectical Reason, attempted systematic synthesis. He argued that individuals make free choices but always within material conditions they didn't choose. Social structures constrain individual action, but individuals through their choices collectively reproduce or transform those structures. This sounded promising. It seemed to preserve both Marx's structural analysis and existentialism's individual freedom. But the synthesis remained unstable. When push came to shove, which had priority? If structures determine consciousness, how is radical freedom possible? If individuals are radically free, how can structures constrain them? Sartre struggled with this his entire career. His early work emphasized individual freedom almost absolutely. His later work emphasized social determination increasingly. He never found stable equilibrium between them. The Frankfurt School, critical theorists like Adorno, Horkheimer, and Marcuse also attempted synthesis. They used Marx's analysis of capitalism but incorporated Nietzschean and Freudian insights about psychology, culture, and domination beyond economics. They argued that capitalism didn't just exploit labor economically. It created forms of consciousness that prevented people from recognizing their exploitation. The culture industry, mass entertainment, consumer society, these weren't just superstructure reflecting the base. They were forms of domination in their own right. This allowed for more complex analysis than orthodox Marxism. It could explain why workers in advanced capitalism didn't become revolutionary. They were integrated into the system through cultural mechanisms, not just economic ones. It could incorporate Nietzschean insights about values and psychology without abandoning Marxist frameworks. But this also made revolutionary change seem almost impossible. If domination operated at every level, cultural and economic and psychological, how could it ever be overcome? The Frankfurt School became increasingly pessimistic, seeing total administration, one-dimensional society, complete integration. Michel Foucault represented another kind of synthesis. He took Nietzsche's genealogical method and applied it to institutions and power relations in ways that resembled Marx's structural analysis. He showed how power operated through knowledge, discipline, normalization, not just through economic exploitation. Foucault's analyses of prisons, hospitals, sexuality revealed forms of power that were both structural, like Marx emphasized, and cultural, like Nietzsche emphasized. Power wasn't just top-down repression, it was productive, creating subjects and identities, operating through institutions and discourses. This offered sophisticated analysis of modern power beyond simple economic reductionism. It could explain forms of domination that weren't primarily economic. It incorporated Nietzschean insights about truth and values serving power while maintaining focus on institutions and structures. But Foucault's framework struggled with normativity. If all claims to truth serve power, on what basis do you critique power? If resistance is just another form of power, why prefer it to domination? Foucault never satisfactorily answered these questions. Feminist theory has wrestled with Marx and Nietzsche productively. Socialist feminism combined Marxist analysis of capitalism with feminist analysis of patriarchy. It showed how gender and class intersected, how women's oppression couldn't be reduced to either economic or cultural factors alone. But this created questions about which was primary. Was women's oppression ultimately rooted in capitalism and solvable through economic transformation? Or was it independent, requiring its own analysis and solution? Different feminists gave different answers, often reproducing Marx-Nietzsche tensions. Some feminist theory drew more on Nietzsche, emphasizing individual women's self-creation and resistance to imposed categories. This led to emphasis on difference, multiplicity, resistance to universal categories. But it struggled to maintain collective politics necessary for social change. Post-colonial theory faced similar challenges. It used Marxist analysis of imperial capitalism and exploitation. But it also emphasized culture, identity, and representation in ways that drew on post-Nietzschean thought. Edward Said's Orientalism combined both approaches, showing how economic imperialism required cultural domination. Yet post-colonial theory also struggled with the tension between structural analysis and emphasis on individual or cultural resistance. Was colonialism primarily economic system or cultural domination? Were they separable? Which had priority? Attempts at reconciliation often ended up privileging one side. Those who emphasized structure and system tended toward Marx. Those who emphasized culture and individual tended toward Nietzsche. Clean synthesis proved elusive. Part of the problem is that Marx and Nietzsche disagreed about fundamentals. They had opposed views of human nature, truth, value, history, society. You can't just combine them because they're incompatible at foundation. Marx thought humans were naturally social and cooperative. Nietzsche thought inequality was natural and necessary. These can't both be true. Either human nature is fundamentally egalitarian or fundamentally hierarchical. Marx thought truth was objective and discoverable. Nietzsche thought truth was perspectival and created. You can't coherently hold both positions. Either there are objective social laws or there aren't. Marx thought history progressed toward freedom. Nietzsche thought history cycled without direction. These visions contradict. Either humanity is improving or it isn't. Marx thought collective action could transform society fundamentally. Nietzsche thought individual transformation was all that mattered. These lead to opposite politics. You can't pursue both simultaneously. Yet many contemporary thinkers implicitly try. They use Marxist analysis of structures while celebrating Nietzschean individual resistance. They emphasize collective identity while valorizing individual difference. They want equality and excellence, justice and greatness. This creates productive tension but also incoherence. The values conflict, the methods contradict. We haven't found synthesis, we've just learned to live with contradiction. Maybe that's the honest position. Maybe Marx and Nietzsche each identified real aspects of human existence that can't be fully reconciled. We are both social and individual, both determined and free, both equal and different. Any philosophy that emphasizes only one side will be inadequate. But this doesn't resolve practical questions. When you have to choose policies, build institutions, organize movements, you can't just say both sides are right. You have to prioritize. You have to choose between collective redistribution and individual freedom, between equality and excellence, between Marx and Nietzsche. Some domains might allow different choices. Maybe we can be Marxist about economic basics, ensuring everyone has material security, while being Nietzschean about culture and meaning, allowing individual creativity and excellence. Maybe we can redistribute wealth while celebrating achievement. But even this division faces problems. Economic inequality affects cultural production. Cultural values affect economic distribution. The domains aren't separable. Choices in one constrain possibilities in the other. The search for synthesis continues because both Marx and Nietzsche identified something essential. We can't reject either entirely without losing crucial insights, but we also can't fully combine them without contradiction. Perhaps the task isn't reconciliation, but dialectical engagement. We hold both perspectives in tension, use each to critique the other's excesses, recognize that truth lies somewhere in the unresolved conflict between them. This is intellectually unsatisfying. We want synthesis, resolution, coherent frameworks. But maybe Marx and Nietzsche between them show why that's impossible. Reality itself contains contradictions. Theory should reflect that rather than pretending to resolve it. At the end of this exploration, we return to the fundamental choice Marx and Nietzsche force upon us. Not a choice between specific policies or programs, but a choice about what question we ask first when trying to understand human life and how to improve it. Marx's question: how are resources and power distributed? Who owns the means of production? Who benefits from existing arrangements? What structures of exploitation and domination shape people's lives? How can we reorganize society to eliminate unjust hierarchies and give everyone access to the material conditions for flourishing? This question leads you to analyze economic systems, class relations, property ownership. It makes you see individuals as embedded in structures that largely determine their opportunities. It suggests that improving human life requires transforming those structures through collective action. When you ask Marx's question consistently, you become focused on fairness, equality, material security. You measure societies by how well they provide for everyone's basic needs. You judge policies by whether they reduce inequality and increase collective power. You seek solidarity and shared struggle. Nietzsche's question: what values and meanings do people live by? What type of human beings does a culture produce? Does society enable excellence and creativity or enforce conformity and mediocrity? Do people affirm life or deny it? Can individuals create their own values, or are they trapped in inherited moralities? This question leads you to analyze culture, psychology, values. It makes you see structures as secondary to the consciousness that creates or accepts them. It suggests that improving human life requires transforming individual consciousness and cultural values. When you ask Nietzsche's question consistently, you become focused on meaning, excellence, vitality. You measure societies by their highest achievements. You judge policies by whether they enable exceptional individuals. You seek individual authenticity and self-overcoming. Both questions capture something real about human suffering. Marx's question identifies structural barriers: poverty, exploitation, lack of access to resources. These cause immense suffering that individual effort can't overcome. You can't will yourself out of economic necessity. You need collective transformation. Nietzsche's question identifies cultural and existential suffering: meaninglessness, conformity, denial of life. These cause immense suffering that structural change alone can't eliminate. You can have material security and still feel your life is empty. You need value transformation. The question is, which kind of suffering is more fundamental? Which should we address first? Or are they equally important? Or does one cause the other? Marx would say economic suffering is fundamental. Cultural nihilism results from capitalist alienation. Give people control over their productive activity, eliminate exploitation, create material abundance, and cultural problems will resolve. Meaning comes from free creative activity, which requires economic transformation. Nietzsche would say cultural suffering is fundamental. Economic arrangements reflect underlying values. Capitalism exists because of certain values around work and wealth. Change those values and economic relations will change. Or more radically, economic arrangements matter less than whether people can create meaningful lives within them. Most people's lives involve both kinds of suffering. They struggle economically and existentially. They lack both material security and meaningful purpose. They need both structural change and value transformation. This suggests both Marx and Nietzsche are necessary, but their solutions conflict. Pursue equality and you may suppress excellence. Pursue excellence and you may perpetuate inequality. Organize collective action and you may suppress individual freedom. Celebrate individual freedom and you may ignore structural barriers. So which question should guide us? In practice, people usually choose based on their circumstances. If you're materially struggling, Marx's question seems obviously primary. You can't worry about self-actualization when you can't pay rent. Economic justice must come first. If you're materially secure but existentially lost, Nietzsche's question seems obviously primary. Your problem isn't poverty but meaninglessness. You need to create values and purpose, not redistribute wealth. This suggests that Marx's question matters more for those who are economically oppressed. Nietzsche's question matters more for those who are economically comfortable. And there's truth in that. Economic security is precondition for existential concerns. But Nietzsche would say this is exactly backwards. The economically comfortable are usually spiritually dead, living comfortable, meaningless lives. The struggling and striving have more vitality, more intensity, more potential for greatness. Comfort kills spirit. And Marx would say that even economically secure people are alienated under capitalism. They may not be poor, but they're still cut off from meaningful, productive activity, still living in false consciousness, still serving capital. Economic transformation would liberate them too. The contemporary world offers evidence for both. Material inequality is increasing, causing real suffering that individual attitude changes can't address. Climate crisis, poverty, exploitation, these are structural problems requiring collective solutions. This vindicates Marx's question. But material prosperity hasn't produced meaning or satisfaction. The most economically advanced societies have epidemics of depression, anxiety, addiction. People have more stuff and less purpose. This vindicates Nietzsche's question. Maybe we need both questions, asked sequentially. First, ensure material security for everyone through Marxist redistribution. Then enable individual meaning creation through Nietzschean cultural transformation, economic justice as foundation, existential freedom as completion. But this assumes they're compatible, that you can have both. What if the economic arrangements that provide security also create the cultural mediocrity Nietzsche feared? What if the individual freedom Nietzsche celebrated requires inequality Marx opposed? We keep returning to this dilemma. Society organized for equality may suppress excellence. Society organized for excellence may perpetuate suffering. Maybe no solution satisfies both values fully. Perhaps the honest answer is that different questions matter more in different contexts. When people are starving, Marx's question matters more. When people are comfortable but empty, Nietzsche's question matters more. Neither question is always primary. But this relativism is also unsatisfying. It means we can't evaluate societies overall, can't say which are better. We can only say, better for material distribution or better for individual meaning? Different people will answer differently based on what they lack. Or perhaps both questions matter always, and good societies must balance them. This requires constant negotiation between competing values, some equality with some hierarchy, some collective provision with some individual freedom, some justice with some excellence. This doesn't resolve the conflict, it just manages it. We're left navigating between Marx and Nietzsche, using both critiques, achieving neither vision fully. This is probably the realistic position. Their conflict is permanent because the values they represent are both essential and incompatible. What we can say definitively is that asking only one question is insufficient. Pure Marxism without attention to meaning and culture produces gray conformity. Pure Nietzscheanism without attention to material conditions justifies cruelty. We need both questions even if we can't fully answer both. In the end, Marx and Nietzsche between them define the space of modern political and existential thought. We're still living in their conflict, still choosing between their priorities, still trying unsuccessfully to synthesize their insights. They showed us the fundamental tensions in modern life between collective and individual, equality and excellence, structure and agency, justice and greatness. They couldn't resolve these tensions, neither can we. But by understanding their conflict, we understand our own situation better. We see why our politics are polarized, why our values conflict, why simple solutions fail. We're Marx's heirs and Nietzsche's heirs, whether we know it or not. The question isn't which one was right. Both were partly right and partly wrong. The question is how we navigate between their truths, how we balance their insights, how we live in the tension they revealed. That's the task they left us. That's the question we're still trying to answer.